Awesome. Close some stuff. And yeah, as soon as we get the 1AC pasted, which it might already be, I'm just scrolling down.
It is in the Discord, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Then you pull this up, and I think I should be all set.
One ready?
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. The first anti-competitive business practice was the imposition of competition in business as practices and properties that define the human. For with the invention of the self-possessed body came the inauguration of the diabolical regime of logistics, the white science of loss prevention, antitrust policy, and racial capitalist monopolization are two sides of the same coin. Both are driven by the compulsive feedback loop of individuated ownership premising. Politics on either merging or breaking up corporate entities first requires accepting the ontological status of personhood as property, which ensures the omnicidal eradication of the flesh and the earth. That's Marin and Harney 21. The first step shows the rightful ownership. This is the theft of the earthly life, and incarcerated in the body of the general regime of private property is most actively understood as social death and corruption. Is our cursed share, our ontological practice, our century and centering the how we invade ownership and how we refuse to prevent loss, their sharing, rubbing empathy, hapticality, undercomes the love of left, our central omnicentric and centricity. Everything in the wake of such disorder is lost prevention, begin with the positing such positioning of a body with for locating ownership in the owned and a mind for owning. This requires the protection of a science of loss, which is say the science of whiteness or logistics, every improvement, the ossification of sharing, given and containment of the first four vessels produced for logistics, not the slave ship of the body, first conceptualized, which bears the individual in subjugation, a profound viciousness with the colonization of the positive body, the appointment of the positive mind, the manipulation of various modalities, the brutality of their mutually developing one where redundancies given in the death perpetual motion of the will to colonize the derivative, draw on the power of the share, but only to create more derivatives, to create more zones of dispossession by positing possession and the denial of the loss of preserves, the loss of all properties lost because all properties, the loss of sharing property is steps absolute serial murder. We survive only of our property remains vulnerable to sharing all properties, fugitive property much jumps the bill. Logistics is a degradation. It means the individuation and privatization are the same thing now. The human ultimate derivative, the fully registered installed logistics, the given illusion of a freestanding subject. Logistics now the subject is for the humanization of the flesh, the racialization of the flesh, of catastrophes, not even the Marxian resertion logistics, the science of whiteness in and as the science of loss, the globalized generalized fear of losses everywhere. Logistics never needs to straighten out the entangled flesh everywhere. The logistics finds monstrosity to humanize it. And how can you say that we are a person of flesh of the earth is assaulted by the global improvement worldly offers like nothing? We'll ever get in the way of development of the race or development of developers, the science of logistics, dreams of the flow without blockers and dreams, define these dreams into reality. Hard logistics and soft logistics are work together. Logistics is regulatory force standing against us and against the earth. Now the loss of the marks, the ownership space of the ownership, private property, the loss of sharing, the loss of the earth, and the constant making of the world, and the simultaneously misapprehension. What is private as attempting and belief by ownership yourself for the emptiness to become private property. It must be filled with the locating the coordinates of space and time emergence, delineation of what is mine in the time against the theft and imposition of what became mine of it. Alignment to emerge with the employment of time and space. And it's logistics you apply more logic, you acquire the more logic you deploy, the more logistics you require. As Billy says, if a transatlantic slave trade is a spice in alignment, it was never the ending quest, and the more concrete because ownership is a perpetual loss. Now this translates into obsession with the loss prevention, logistics emergence of the science of moving properties to the emptiness and making of the world itself by filling and converting everything in his path and coordinate time and space or ownership and such loss prevention, the mode of operation by the weakness of the Atlantic slave trade and the massive diabolical commercial logistic, a double loss of experience, intensification of the ownership, feedback loop, the subsequent reaction of the evil employment of Africans, the potential loss of property that can making the Syrian practice, establish the space time possession, self-possession, the ownership, every step they take is standing off the ground, is stopping of the world out of it, the earthly existence, interracial capitalist human being. It grows more pronounced the more it is threatened, and it produces a sharper and sharper subject reaction in the face of this threat to overcome the block to achieve this act of logistic things to straighten us out and entangle us and open us up to restrict improving us. Logistic requires and plotting in its bodies in space, which in territory can be imposed capacity territory can be not in the constant measure and about regulation of the flesh and the earth, and the resolution is an antisocial contract. A brutal edict demands endless iterative yet self-improvement in the name of perfecting market conditions. This strokes a fantasy of ethical or managed capitalism at the level of debate requires the participation in internalize the logistical mandates of argument refinement in an as endless accumulation. The topic mystifies the blurring of public and private sectors so that both may be weaponized against the social life of the undercommons, as Marin and Harney 21. The anti-social contract is claiming to justify the violence of the human being. Now, why the African and indigenous people are being exterminated inside so much of the world, like the Europeans, the Crusaders, Europeans, and believing the brutality is part of the humanity, then exceptions of the anti-social contract emerge to contain the obvious historical exceptions of the Europeans, essentially being subject to the exchange, that being a party change, and those who are not the one who are numeral and accountable and even have been accumulated would even better to think of the anti-social contract as emerging against a history of the revolt of nature who made it so to stand for nature, having philosophy relegated to them essentially paradoxical state of nature by the ones who seek to engineer nature's subordination to and within the sociological disaster of improving the social contract understood as an improvement improvement rather than the genocidal imposition. It is wrong and incomplete. Also, as an economic practice, the practice of the juridical self-regulation and anti-socialization of exchange. The economic contract emerges from the idea that ownership derives from its improvement. The individual state capable of self-improvement. The improvement individual is a self-accumulating individual improvement of its own and on its own more. It sets into motion further accumulation of the self and others. Nature all might come to work. No ownership extended and diffused through the regime. The social contract defines itself. Ownership that will be taken as completed from the individual. Fixation on fixing. The murderous interplay of capture and improvement is given in and self-improvement and self-accumulations. Balance towards whatever shows up as the rendezvous of differentiation and completion affection and inscribed upon the flesh and those who cannot be and said and refuse to be a party to the anti-social exchange under the terms of the anti-social contract. Contractors, they are dedicated to killing each other to in war and as their beloved public carried out in the name of improvement. The self-accumulating individuals rendering a redeemable and very premise on the anti-social contract. Progress was a destructive in notions of exchange encountered amongst the feudal rebels or exchange encountered amongst Africans who would rather move elsewhere than to enter in the conflict. Soon gave improvement awards about improvement of the European race, militarily enforce externalities of dead and deadly body politic and monsters whose mechanized drone-like simulations of spirit regulate the social associated with police commissioners and the university probe its anti-social social abilities that based on the social contract. Improvement is war, which is why the public sphere is war. Now those anti-social contracts haunted by the economic contract based on the claim to ownership of oneself and others in nature tied to one can make up and accumulate and through oneself and others in nature expanding universe. The ownership took a contractual form that was not limited to free individuals. So requires a broad spectrum contract is the material ground of exclusive and exclusionary bonds exchange prevents accumulation added the elimination of its source of the self-improving subject exchange as a differential and differentiating entanglement of social life even under the most powerful form of constraint and regulation. It's about a social optimum. This logistical imperative to improve yields a racialized expatiation of all planetary existence which culminates in the destruction of the earth. That's Monin and Harney 21. A commitment to the continuous improvement means the brutal specialization of all the improvement comes away as by an invasion land tenure and where individual ownership derived from the increasing the land's productivity is given in perpetual self-possession intertwined with the ability to make more productive and land must be violently reduces productivity, which is a regulatory diminishment of the management of earth generativity. This reduction of the earth to the productivity into submission of the earth, the techniques of domination to isolate and enforce acceleration of the productivity, just as the earth must be forcibly speciated to be possessed, man must be forcibly speciated himself, speciated humans are endlessly proof of the endless work they do in their endless way to becoming man. The emergent relation being specialization and racialization at the very conception of the conceptualization of the Enlightenment is the universalization such globalization of the imperative to possess and its corollary, the imperative to improve already present in the very idea of man. The exception's attribution is already exposed to the essential lack and is achieved alongside the imposition of a possession by improvement to take policies supposed to be staged upon everybody and everything to inflict inflict empowerment in the name of the improvement to invoke the universal law of the obstructive man. And we affirm logisticality as an anti-competitive practice for undercommon disassembly that steals away from policy-based metaphysics of individuation. Debate is a form of synaptic labor where ballots over consecutive rounds synchronize participants to a settler rhythm that algorithmically entrenches logistical subjectivity. Only a practice of study that emphasizes the fugitive discomposition of the self-possessed subject could produce an ungovernable theory in practice. Voting affirmative is a form of irregular exchange that recognizes we can never be stolen. What can never be stolen is the power to give everything away. That's Monin and Harney 21. There's a rhythm making a world. This invites individuation into the world. The undercommon track would remain fugitive from the emergent logistics of this deadly rhythm and exhausted to be formed in the rhythm, algorithmically composed to be compelled to carry this rhythm, develop and improve it, export and import, be algorithmically composed, not just be beaten, but to beat synaptic labor, the compulsion of logistical capitalism against the surrounding informality, the unselves of 0, 1, 1, 2 with a militant neither one nor its absence. Synaptic labor is the first instance to be opened involuntarily by the compulsion and capacity of this rhythm to this rhythm that kills the popular rhythm upon the earth to regulate the rhythm to form roving beats upon against fugitive groups that come back intensively and basically internally in the synaptic labor to live in the world as an individual, therefore to be logistic and logistic to be settled into the rhythm that kills and to beat out the rhythm of the undercommon tracks that keeps giving away its own measure to social life. If the thing is important to the undercommon, it's not a collision, it's an absolutely open secret with no professional ambition. The evaluation of local absurdity takes the form of forgetting, which manifests itself as mourning for a mass movement that can never in some ways move from logisticality to logisticality, from force availability in the flesh as Horton Spillers puts it into a mechanic for undercommon tacticality is itself a spooky action to diss the exterior effect and effects of the intramural. The only defense is openness, the only owning is unowning and giving everything away until you have nothing, give it all away until you have nothing. You gotta give it up, you gotta give hope against hope, and it gets rid of you, and stealing whether in self or nor worlds are graspable closer to you, grasping either one, the closer we get to disappearing. The social skills of the anti-social can't compare to the sociality of the more plus less than the skill to those whose problem is that they have no problem. This shit they call social skills is an algorithm for managing anti-sociality, sensory crossing orders, emergence and hierarchization of things, which is some primitive shit to the moral plus those are the myths who are in the myths who are mixed disorder. You're the mixture mixed masters minding and digging the 0 ones with a pre-given accountable measurable formula for something that has only worked in provisional practice, and where we have no problem, where the problem disappears in precision and purity, and where we must move and measure like it is there. Open for cross-checks.
First question, what is hope?
What is hope? I mean, I don't think that one necessarily takes a particular stance on hope. I don't think. Kate, do you?
In your last note, Moten and Hardy card, you talk about how
Oh.
you got to hope against hope that it gets a hold of you. What does that mean?
I think we would frame our relationship to hope in a kind of active nihilist way, in that there is no point in. Okay, hold on a second. I have to go blow my nose. Can we come back to this question in like 2 seconds? You can ask Jeremy whatever's next.
Sure. So how does the 1AC resist capital?
Yeah, we think the capital opposition through the kind of the imposition of this office structure where we have to constantly improve ourselves, improve the flow of logistics, the improvement of the movement of commodities and bodies.
Sure, but how does
Ideas
the
as well.
1AC
We think that our form of logisticality is kind of a blockage to that, and that it kind of, to put it in, that it tries to disassemble that the freestanding subject of logistics that is wants to and constantly improve those flows. It's a stand against that, or performative refusal of that kind of
So how does saying
imposition
no
product.
to capitalism like refuse it?
It's not a no to capitalism. It's about how we because we don't think that like voting after neg necessarily like causes some kind of spill out from the space. We think that rather it's how we orient ourselves within this space and the kind of values that we adopt and the way we can form solidarity or a community with that like through one another, that we think necessitates
Sure. Kate, go ahead.
I'm back. Yeah, sorry, Jeremy. So in an active nihilist sense, which is that like there is no grand plan, there is no like endpoint to a line of flight, there is no static definition of being or relating, but rather that we can understand that we are still living, that there are sites for sociality, that there are paths forward, even if those paths are non-linear, that there is hope in the idea that there is no endpoint, that there is no purpose, because that means that there is no like absolute nature of like oppression or suffering or capital.
So I'm pretty sure the 1AC defines capitalism as the all-encompassing oppression that is there. Is that true?
I mean, that seems like a very narrow definition. I think that's going to be a lot more complicated than that. Our Moten and Hardy evidence describes the kind of logistical flows that have been inaugurated since like the Middle Passage, and how that has developed into things like global supply chain, which is now the networks through which capital circulates itself.
Okay, if
the way the
capital
commodities are
is the
flowed, we
only-
think that
isn't
our
the
debate
only
is
structure of
What was the
power that the
question?
1AC resists, then what are the other structures of power?
well, it's not that there are other structures of power, but rather that they're entangled, and we need to start from that position of their entanglement, i.e. the entanglement between like capitalism and settler colonialism and anti-blackness. And that's why we kind of use the term racial capitalism in the 1AC, because it's necessary to forefront those things by understanding their entanglement with
Sure.
logistics.
So what is the endpoint of the 1AC?
I think Kate answered this already. We don't necessarily have that kind of endpoints or kilos. Rather, we think it's about the kind of process of sociality that we're cultivating in debate.
I want to see what's sent, right? Cool. All right.
Wait, I think I gotta send it again.
Okay.
I have it. I'm just opening it.
So it's this.
Where's the most? Okay, there it is. Got it.
Let me know when everybody's ready and I'll start.
I'm good whenever.
Sorry, Faith.
Oh, sorry. What's the order? Sorry, that.
Too off in case.
Good whenever you are, Faith, if everyone else is.
Right. Starting with here, our interpretation that the negative should not be burdened by rejoinder against after defend anything other than desirability of a topical plan winning, that the United States federal government should not substantially increase prohibitants on anti-competitive business by the private sector by at least expanding the scope of its core antitrust rights should always be a sufficient condition for voting negative. Resolve means enacted policy by law, words in phrase 64. Revolve is by the legislature to establish by law, and USFG means three branches as OECD 87. The U.S. federal government is composed of three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Violation affirmative is not extremely defend an instance of the United States federal government that should substantially increase prohibitants on anti-competitive business practices. Two impacts: one, predictable limits. They are are a prerequisite to scholarship because it determines participation within the debate by ensuring research accessibility and negative ground. Interpretation is explosive and which allows after mobilize prep and research in light of an anchor to the topic is a free plastic recontextualized 1AC, which makes negative engagement impossible and destroys good scholars. If they don't get to weigh the app, it's just as likely that they're winning because of it, we weren't able to prepare to defeat it. And two, class debates about scholarship in the vacuum. We get reactionary generics. They allow the app to submit infinite prep advantages where all they need to do is find and supporting any ideological orientation towards support only process of researching and reflecting on the topic prior to debating that changes mind, but without a predictable and limited resolution, teams resort to gut reactions that entrench bias, as good in Meyer 3. People that get to the issue to acquire information, they can hard about it, deliberate process, but deliberate individual will give much thought to be rather a reflection of position may be aroused to be of kind of following the others and language based upon incomplete information process, fully reason assessment, internal reflection that requires to call up on a reason measure consultant does about process of fixing one's attention on the topic, the fix the predetermined process of shaping and resharpening focus attention to the topic, and inviting people to think in a way to the process of information and the issue, the phases of considerable impact that to people's minds that this is single common ground of which debates are conduct. And speaking in language of power allows debaters to manage to read ways to redirect state policy against itself. That's Delanion 12. Infiltrate about to operate in enemy lines, infiltrate the detective when thinking about operating within current institutional realities, threats of an emergent in environments of the economic collapse, psychological alienation, and immutable aggression, conflict matter what's under these conditions and persistent ACP conceptualized dated narratives of the blood to the struggle and no like did not open about identity positive resistance and a position for radical hope and correcting the empire state that infiltrated radical politics. The moment should think about assuming the same tactic that infiltrated the way to think about the practice within the institutional realities and infiltration can be a theoretical framework of situation where the practice is looking for the opportunity to sabotage dominate the concept of the world that demonstrates other world is possible to tell decisions and the basis of critical reflection on what we actually done, such as political organization and art, that we all face, but not stop us from doing something. And on to the K, the 1AC's politics and anti-sociality is subject to value capturing and locating hegemony within culture, systematic deprives existence of an accounting of a major tone and enables elites to realtor political demands in accordance with liberal representationalism. This locks in capitalism. None of their leaked defense to identify politics or corruption arts applies because it fails to take into account how the gamification of debate and broader university extracts value even from supposedly persistent performance. That's Towell 20. Alliances of weapon identity politics never goes up to the group and rather than ability to identity politics are to the elite culture. Political projects can be headed in a well of business and knowledge and knowledge and value get distorted by our parts. It is what stands between us and coalition politics and critical support for political perspective without regard to the political effects. So they'll be preoccupation with what really is rich white people. Confusing the real world with the structure of the game really lead to value culture or process by which was rich in values and culture simplify version of our social life and realize our values and simplicity. Value that doesn't require anyone's deliberate it's only a value structure that encourages excess value charity such elite culture turns a whole group's value structure. The tragedy of mainstream politics away from radical level dramatically displays in itself or how space touting itself as women to exploit the women who work for the elite. Abuse of identity politics is the salient problem leads to unspeakable violence upon the practitioners. A subgroup of people without power to access after the tribe and create political rallies. Elites are different from people affected by the decision they made to capture the world's group to forcing a narrow social project that a group would if the power were to related shooting. And the refusal of political mobilization targeting the state of society locks in neoliberal capitalism catastrophic economic change. The foremost task of political left should be developed strategies to retake power and break down capital. That's Parenti 15. Microchick is not a people, it is not a demand of the government, which is true anti-state rhetoric. It turns right to state is not just prison and military, it's a head start. The EPA, there's a reason right is the attacking needs when left embraces the billion outside the government. It cuts itself off from the American research station. The arena of class struggle when the left turns its back on the government, it fails to reshape the government, using the government as for progressive. It is a risky plan to the right government. It's bad to justify strategy. We need to defend the progressive work of the government. I mean, not an asset. I think movements should attack the government, should attack it until they comply to left. Thinking about ways it can leverage the government, but actually legal and institutional mechanisms by which we can contain and control capital. And important to think about the hierarchies and bureaucracies. The EPA has the power to decarbonize the economy. Activists are not making demands at the EPA because the internet ethos ignoring the government is dominant worldview on the left. The fossil fuel industry is one of the most powerful forces I've ever seen. What could stand up to them? The state government has laws to wipe out the complex. We should use the government to levy astronomical fines on the companies for pollution. The white local elites were free to push black people around, defeat the risen benefits of the white working class, the anti-700 comes from petition tradition. The state is a center of oppression and violent bureaucracy. The government is humane and offers redistribution. The government is militarized policing, anti-state ideology. It's stirred up from elites and neoliberal project. It's anti-state rhetoric. It's hard for the left to see through the sketches. Textually toxic environment in which activists are approaching climate emergency. Reconstrue the state, mobilize and transform the society. We have to reduce emissions. Carbon is the most pressing issue, and it's a try or die. Resisting capital is necessary to avoid climate destruction and inequality that will lead to extinction. That's Robinson 16. Faced with a stagnant economy, elites have returned to the water opportunities. The crisis becomes systemic and inequalities then over accumulation. The batteries. Sorry. already call up over manipulating these spirit channels in the scapegoat communities. We have already exceeded the boundaries of convention, not just on an average acidification of oceans, the undertopics and glaciers, for by social conditions, have to appellate of surveillance, cultural emergence, added military maximum waiting and mobilize against scapegoat, but the limits come minimizing communities between the wars and endless destruction and capitalism makes nuisance of the slavery possible, prison labor, special exploited immigrant population at the risk of genocide. The critique of capitalism must influence the practice of movements. Our survival may depend on it, and the alternative is to build solidarity around a mass socialism of individual equality, fractures movements, and fails to spur social or institutional change. That's Drake and Reed 15. We must have predicted the impulse of the utopia did not know to say for cities where how mass socialist movement based in a new situation mobilizing cross solidarity. The movement building requires mobilization and the anti-capitalist born at answered. The priority is something needs to the market versus struggles to expand institutes like housing, transportation, healthcare, and education, create a new public to realize the movement is bold of class analysis and to moralizing for political discourse attempts to establish the circle to inhibit the class-based organization should by mentality are preaching then building the constitution driving away working class voices. The models are successful when they try to leverage existing power to outwards and strategically organize and leverage political opportunities to build power for working people who focus on the choke points of capitalism and going out the case. One, you vote negative presumption. When they see lacks a clear methodology, structural impacts, any solve turns case, ineffective organizing leads to burnout because it's not attached to any real method or mobilization. It's too late to debate, for them to backtrack and imply that when they see anything more than theoretical analysis. Burnout is the individual impact. The process of individualization work without works leads to quantification under academy that redefines structures of capitalism and leaves it. It halts the movement production while dominant powers learn to infiltrate the undercommons. And two, burden of proof academics act is already planned through debating and the status quo. There is no intrinsic benefit to reading the within the debate, and thus no reason to affirm the strategy. And three, the planning doesn't spell like competition. You ally yourself with people who vote for you and alienate those who are forced to debate against you, ensuring the failure of your movement. You align yourself with the possibility of what moves you do, such as free healthcare and abolishing the police, and for returns kiss symbolically affirming the method of bodies like the ties and materials should this power regulars and non-A. 9. If every failed is already known the material condition, powerless to learn and accumulate their then it's right your argument against this evidence of resistance in the federal broader relations in the material code, recognizing like this is a powerful group that becomes the resistance do not differentiate between practice to produce alter power by involve person power to become independent dominate differently or particularly that alternative as that challenge is necessary to do more speak. Power is to demonstrate it and add up to broader changes because changes. And the digital age makes politics subversion impossible to results are meal aesthetic description is industry from the production of Moen and Harney critique. That's Cohen 16. We were going to be running 100 months with study has surrendered of the casting side active justice subverted. I might have felt like I lost the surgeon now electric like somebody appropriated while coming to use it a creative work with coupons of adaptive can't be no politics of subversion freely planning velocity favorite synthetic meters within digital front of study place and emphasis on possibility of reform for the grants to real world problems in a university. That's Taylor 16 to the problems of evidence of within the market presence where of anxieties deep in the middle class evidence making it conscious. There's little refuge in University. Kelly argues for there need to be in a university rather than be up and I don't think you're keep naming the representation. We see the Americans about that does not mean limited reforms are worthwhile. It depends by country to represent efforts to transport the condition of campuses they live within. Demands that might not readily transport a university coming before, but they have the position based about racial equality, inequality, and Moen relies on misapplication and hit rejected as Marriott 16. It's about design explaining why I want this community telling the law of fairness writing on blackness and that it's what the world gets because the the meaning of black is not prescribed. If blackness is always committed vision and either law of representation can capture blackness is why a whole other diversity which apparently always escape laws during my brightness of blackness. The case of the movement has moved towards a position that the only black when it exceeds racial disavowal has relied on the narrative pathology that he cannot do without, cut the cut without, and the state is inevitable. If we don't get to take away just any method exclusive occurs our policy, the mind of what that right will feel better right. That's 216. Separately the engagement on the basis of engagement can be replicating on hierarchies that recognizes our effective means we disempower ourselves over the state, making demands does not entail the diversity we're already involved in state policy because we always submitted to state power. The strategy must be decided according to particular conditions. For reference, I didn't read King 16 and Bryant 12 at the bottom.
Do you think you could upload a marked version of the 1NC in the Discord?
Sure. Although it is just those two cards straight down at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple, I think you said you were cutting them somewhere and then you didn't read them at the bottom. If you could just send like a version with, I guess, reflecting that.
A marked doc would definitely be good. Sorry, thank you. Oh, I'm frozen. I'm gonna need to figure out what is up with my video before the actual season starts.
Might just be like a Wi-Fi thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's like a software thing because like I've been having this problem even when I was still in Denver.
Maybe like delete Zoom, re-download it.
Have I tried?
I wanted to
turning
say turn it on and off again, but I don't.
Yeah.
Think that's
Give me 1 sec to grab a before we start cross-section, I think give me 1 sec to just grab my laptop charger.
No worries.
Hey, what is Binghamton like?
I have no idea. I've never been there.
You've
It's
never been there?
Nope. I've
Um,
seen, like a map of it, but never been there.
Have you ever been to upstate New York, just like in general, like Syracuse maybe?
No,
Not
I've never
Syracuse.
been.
I've been to like. Oh, I thought.
It's
Sorry,
like
go ahead.
there are like 3 blocks of downtown with like restaurants and bars and like clubs. And then there's the university and there's a hospital. And there's like student housing, and then there's like this very unfortunate like de facto segregation between the students and the like
Oh.
counties. It's really, really bad and like toxic. And then if you leave Binghamton, if you drive for like 10 minutes in any direction, you start seeing Confederate flags. It's a lot. Like,
Welcome to upstate.
mhm. Where are you at school? Oh, thank you. I see the marked version of the doc.
I go to school at Amherst, which is in Massachusetts.
Oh, that's cool as hell. I know it well, just because I am from Nashua. So as a result, you're like 25 minutes away from me.
That's
Usually.
awesome.
Yeah.
Are you like coaching for anyone at
New Hampshire no longer has debate teams, unfortunately. I think the death of my alma mater was the last.
Mhm.
And I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado right now. So
Okay.
How is it? How's the weather? I heard it was raining a lot.
it was drizzly. That was nice, to be honest. It's now kind of hot, and I'm getting used to the not having AC kind of thing. So I have like 2 different fans going in here.
Yep.
I had to sleep on the
But-
ground last night because we have to
Oh my
get
God.
because we just haven't gotten the bed yet. We're getting it now.
Fair enough. But no humidity is probably nice in terms
That's
of like,
so much nicer. It's like it was weird walking out and like
yeah.
seeing how bright everything was, but not feeling as just absolutely swimming as it was in Waco.
Yeah. No, that's one of my favorite things is like the 2 places where you can walk off the plane and immediately know where you are Florida and Denver.
I
And
hear that. I can speak to that from personal experience.
yeah. Anyway, cross-ex.
Okay, there. I was just making sure I had the marked version open. So are you ready, Faith?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. My first question is about this, the first card in the cap K. I was wondering if you could explain what value capture is.
Okay. So essentially it's like the commodification of identity, the idea that you can capture identity, and then that in turn goes back into like representation of capital. It allows for capitalism to take that and utilize it against resistance, essentially. It allows for the university to kind of take that aesthetic of
Okay.
identity and use it as a way of.
That makes sense. The card says, quote, that confusing the real world with the structure of the game can lead to value capture. My question is, how isn't this the alternative? Because you're positing that you're bringing the real world into the game of debate and acting as if it's like this real place where we can just mobilize socialist movements. So I guess like, why doesn't that also apply to the alternative?
Okay, well, it's going back to the idea that there's a difference between movement formation and this idea of like the broader mystical kind of theology of the affirmative. Movements can be operated or created at any level, but then there's the idea of identity recreation, and that's the process in which the academy can't commodify it. That can't really happen with movements. You can't stop a movement in the academy, but you can stop those specific instances of identity creation that they can.
What's the bright
capitalize on.
line for what a movement is?
At this point, like in accordance with the 1NC, it'd be material action or some sort of
What is
spill up
material
that results
action?
in, yeah,
Well, what is it?
like material. Like in this case, it'd be having a methodology in which to enact yourself as opposed to just like a general.
How is
like,
the alternative you or Skycat enacting yourselves if you're not building the socialist movement in this debate space, but rather like fiating it in this like hypothetical world?
Well, it's still like in opposition to the fundamental aspects of the affirmative, it's still the idea that we should look at it from an aspect of not individualized politics, but rather a broader movement that we can act ourselves into.
If we win that
consider we're in
we're
debate
not in
itself.
individualized politics, does this link go away?
Not necessarily, because it's still the key thing is essentially that you don't have a particular movement formation, and that it's just fracturing via
Okay, I
declaration
have
of
like 30
identities.
seconds left, and I think we've exhausted that point. So you read this like Parenti 15 evidence and the Robinson evidence, you're kind of saying like we have to do the alt or we're all going to die from climate change. Why is that like, let me like find the right word to phrase this. Why are we responsible for like climate change like inevitably happening? Why is
Okay,
that a
well,
reason to reject the AF?
because like it's still like a time frame argument. Like climate change is coming out, and it comes as a result
What's
of
the internal
capitalism.
link between the
And
judge
so
voting negative for
fracturing
the
of
alternative
movements
and
is
resolving
that.
climate change?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
What was the internal link between the judge voting negative and resolving climate change? But that's cross, so that's
Movement
fine.
formation. Let's see.
Okay, I'm gonna send it. It is case with those poems that we talked about, overview line by line, and then framework, then cap. Let me send the doc really quickly. Hold on. I have a love-hate relationship with verbatim. I feel like everybody does, but like,
Since switching to a Mac, verbatim has been like really annoying to use. Like if I'm ever in what is it called? Web layout, it'll just like jump to the top of the document randomly. So now I have to like always debate in draft mode.
oh God.
Yeah, I mean it's
That
nice because
has-
it like perfectly like all my blocks just automatically fit onto half of my screen, so I can just have like another thing on the other side. It just somehow like knows the right amount to move it.
It's the 14th. Or no, it's the 4th. I keep doing that. I would be so freaked out if it was the 14th. Preseason would be tomorrow.
Yeah, that would be kind of soon.
That would be, I think, too soon, perhaps. Okay, here we go. 2AC.
Can you say the order one more time?
Yeah, for sure. Case, framework, cap, and there are poems on case. Do you want me to send the poems? I'm not gonna like spread them, so I don't think it should be an issue. Anyone?
Send the poems. Why not?
All right. I'm just gonna paste them into Discord. There you go. Turns out there are poems about Monopoly. Who knew? I guess it's not really surprising. There are poems about everything. Whoops. Okay. Oh my God, that was almost really problematic, but it wasn't. We're chilling.
Did you almost spill like a water bottle on your computer or something?
It's always Red Bull. It's
Oh,
always the Red Bull cans. If
I
you
feel
watch
like that
the
would be
demo-
really sticky. Like it would just like mess up your keys.
yeah, no, like if you watch the demo debate, and definitely feel no pressure to do so, but if you do, you can watch me spill a Red Bull all over my flows in the middle of one of the speeches, and that was a lot for me to deal with.
My freshman year in high school, someone spilled a Coca-Cola on my computer and someone else's computer.
Oh God.
Yeah, it didn't really work well after that, to say the least.
My partner, my 4th year of college, was just absolutely infamous in terms of spilling every liquid that he got his hands on. It was unbelievable. Like we bought him a spill-proof cup, which he supposedly spill-proof cup, which he immediately tried to test by just turning over and spilling water all out over the ground.
Oh my God.
It has to be half a dozen or more rounds that I can just immediately remember him spilling water in. Like it was absurd.
You gotta get him like a sippy cup. I feel like
That's what we did, and he spilled that one too.
that's like impressive. Honestly, like props to him for like going that hard. I don't think I could do that. All right. Is anybody not ready? Cool. Let's hit it. Finally, the day dawned when a monopoly owned everything in the world, so it went looking for its stockholders to celebrate, but they were all owned by it. They were all dead, they were someplace. Their photographs hung in elevators which went up and down, carrying nobody. Everyone else was in bed doing exercises to get in shape for noon. Hey, the monopoly said, let's uncork the World Trade Center, get blotto, silence. The monopoly scowled. All it wanted was a little good fellowship, like you get in the high-rise apartment buildings. Then the sky got awful dark. Gee, and everyone was in bed frantically doing those exercises that get us in shape for death, exercises known as kissing, fucking, caressing. Everyone was unaware that they had been bought or that the earth was about to sell them to the moon for a little light. Monopoly. Almost bankrupt and only recently released from jail, she owes her 10 quid, 400 quid in rent for landing on this new hotel in Bond Street. He owns most of the West End and several public utilities. She pleads poverty. He points out she could give him Leicester that's fun, square, and they could come to some arrangement over her arrears. She thinks how this is what capitalism does to children, brutalizes them, makes them worship 500-pound notes, little red boxes, encourages them to sniff out the weak and charge them exorbitant rent, rob them blind, make them beg. She watches his fingers fatten on his stash. The overview. The conversation has shifted. We are no longer abiding by the language of empire, but rather our own language. We are defining our existence and refusing the codification of ourselves into nothing but the populations needing to be tamed. Don't you know what this resolution is dictating, forcing us to speak about the parchment chains they've created, making us submit to their governance that only works to silence and destroy their process of accumulation, brings us to a place where the Caribbean is a cash crop and a vacation spot, Southeast Asia, a military base, Africa, an endless harvesting ground for blood diamonds, in the Middle East, a hot spot for black gold. What is life beyond the gaze of the white neoliberal subject? What is life outside this realm of benign colonialism and disruption? Poetry is a poesis is our path outside the bubble of the subject of the antisocial contract. It is a denial of the objectification of lived experiences and subjectivities of the word of the resolution and of that world, and the key to breaking down the coercive quantification that produces the violence of omnicide, the line-by-line misread presumption. Let's talk about this card. Quote, everyday forms of resistance are not as worthy of the label as those which bring about lasting change or critiques the celebratory accounts of radical movements and spaces in the quote discursive production of non-compliance, end quote. First is the labor DA, who is the negative to criminalize survival strategies for those who face the worst violences of racialized capitalism, this constant burden, the expectation to have a perfect method to clean up the messes of the billionaire elite is victim blaming and leads to individuated violence, which turns decay, and psychological violence, which is the internal link to burnout. This fractures movements and means the alt feels. Second is that we are material. The poesis of the undercommons is not an endpoint. There are no endpoints in the lines of flight and rhizomatic assemblages, but there are no movements without a space to plan, strategize, and relate to each other, to live outside, to live. The undercommons, the prerequisite to these things like Stonewall, the Salsa Soul Sisters, and Take Back the Night. The French Revolution had salons, the Haitian Revolution had the mines, the mountains, and the fields. And we have the undercommons on the Cohen evidence. One that says description is indistinguishable from field of planning and study. The need to draw lines between these things is the will to order a failed project that inevitably terminates in resentment. Two is that this card doesn't mention poesis, make them explain how they link to our specific advocacy. The Taylor evidence, quote from their evidence, quote, I don't disagree with the basic claims that the university reflects all of the institutional racism and biases that we see throughout American society, but that does not mean that these limited reforms are not worthwhile, end quote. This is in the context of student protests. Okay, fine, let students protest, have small scale reforms. They are already happening. There's no reason why we have to be the ones to do them. They don't trade off. This magnifies the labor DA. Why are we being held accountable for every radical movement ever? The Marriott evidence. One is that Phnom is a psychoanalyst reading Freud, who was a misogynistic homophobic shitbag. Two, Heidegger was a literal member of the Nazi party who wrote to explicitly and specifically justify and encourage the Holocaust. Who cares what they intended? Misapplication's good. And two, when I get to framework, you can cross-apply the empiricism DA on the King and showed evidence. One, if co-option is inevitable, it's try or die. This magnifies the labor DA because it's criminalization of something that they have said is non-unique. Two, it links to the alt at best. That means it's non-unique. And three, I already cross-applied the labor DA framework. Counter-interpretation teams should be able to defend poetic interpretations of the affirmative. These interpretations allow individuals to interpret the resolution through different subjectivities and thus increase participation from folks from marginalized groups, and opens up discussions about different ways certain populations have been affected by U.S. imperialism and logistical capitalism. This turns any education impact because the counter-interpretation allows us to produce different forms of knowledge beyond the intelligibility of the white cishet able-bodied male gaze. Their interpretation is grounded in a logic of reparation in which the argument, refinement, and truth testing contribute to the creation of a good citizen, replicating a violent logistics of calculation. Instead, you should prefer the one he sees strain of against normative models of topical engagement as a research experimental mode of intramural engagement that doesn't require the negs tautological predictable limits to operate. This is the empiricism DA I talked about in case that's Moten in 15. Logic, preparation, grounded on origin, wholeness, and general equivalent bounded with empiricism, relation between reparation, representation, without truth, way, making whole normative becoming a subject, systematical politics, implementation, remains untranslated, these resistance, make innovation possible, assemblage, and image, disaster, interpretation, performance, and face of unintelligibilities of privileged access, some of their work representation, and representation, the point, none of our calculation, not bound to replicate the horrors of speculation, materialized imagination, already in the side of equivalence. Omnicide, the imposition of a static and unifying definition, the resolution by which all debate is structured on, is rooted on the omnicidal attempt to make things measurable and predictable. Governance is the only able to function by rendering some ways of life and living to be rational and others to be destroyed to keep up the illusion justifying imperialism and colonialism as a means of control by which framework is debate's way of making debate measurable. This controls the internal link to fairness because debate is terrible. If debate produces fascist debaters and arguments, there's also a micro-fascism. DA forcing marginalized folks to mimic our oppressors like the USFG is forcing us to be the cops in our own heads. It makes us think that these systems built against us can liberate us. Like when POC become cops, it produces people like Ben Carson, Clarence Thomas, who thinks black and black crime is really internalized idea of society's law and order, and they think they have to police other black people. The law is better at changing black police at black people than other way around. This also spills into the way we police black debaters outside of grounds like calling police on debaters at Harvard, and a coercive diplomacy. DA framework has spoken and unspoken agreements where they have twisted and almost unspoken agreements between the judge and the neg, where they understand the neg is saying the app doesn't really matter, so I'm going to vote for the neg. Framework is coercive diplomacy. K-teams have to bend over backwards even with press sheets, and gaining any type of access to discourse that's not neutral. It has so many assumptions interpersonally and politically. Limits. The idea of limits operates under the assumptions of staticism of language and perpetuates the same kind of violence as being critiqued by the F3 arguments. 1, limits are moving the goalpost to any discussion of futurity and do not allow for these conversations to go beyond how to utilize oppressive institutions. 2 is limits enforces policing of language and knowledge and determining which apps are topical and which are not is inherently violent and results in the erasure of any possible interpretations beyond the words and definitions that are intelligible within the periphery of the white neoliberal subject. 3, it assumes that language is neutral and objective, which ignores the historical context and subjectification of languages. Switch side. We never get to switch sides on what forms of debate and forms of language are deemed valuable in the status quo, which in turn forecloses debate on what approach the topic is best. KVK debates are destroyed, in which critical to understanding various perspectives on what relationships we can have to statecraft and language. And advocacy skills is a bad metric, not who has access to skills, but whose skills can be recognized. You can cross-apply the labor DA here, even if debate was in a vacuum. What we take away is still disproportionate. And I already answered fairness and education. Predictability is an excuse to constantly erase teams that perform creative interpretations of the topic. Even if we are predictable and at the heart of the topic, framework teams with silver and predictability impacts an effort to only have discussions that are intelligible to white academia. Forcing teams to only run affirmative seems predictable, perpetuates homicide because it demands that things be predictable in order to be controlled, and thus you can acknowledge a sacrifice for the greater good. And seeds of political. This can be cross-applied onto the state phobia argument. Link turn. The political is poetic, understanding the way that we relate to each other and how it is informed by the internalized notions of productivity is a form of political engagement that creates the space to formulate who we are and what we can be. Only the app can destroy political cynicism that leads people away from engagement into 4chan. The political has already been seeded. That skill into page 14. The American citizen public policy outlines the most influential business oriented groups negatively related to advocacy preferences of economically to far more independent impact reflect policymakers refusing to consider the majority does not roll, and majority citizens disagrees, they lose. Even a large minority favor policy changes. They don't get a reason that the information expectations accompanied by inclination worked for the common good. It makes very little difference what the general public thinks. Cap. Their analysis of capitalism is wrong, starting from the standpoint of dialectics, and that class obfuscates the way the capital is produced by the afterlife of slavery that does not become logistical capitalism. Harney indicated how the assembly line of modern capitalism comes about from the regulatory mechanism that were developed for chattel slavery and through the desire to master and render all life productive. Focus on parties and mass civilization is not the destruction of capitalism, but a recreation of the desire to control that only marks the afterlife of slavery. Dooming their strategy to fail orientation towards polices capable of refusing the mastery over others that capitalism thrives on through creating subjectivities not overdetermined by capitalism. And perm to each poetic communication is necessary to unchain our imaginations from commodity form and open up the possibility for intimacy that is not changed by capitalist realism. Any communism that disavows is inevitable falls back into the structural failures of capitalism. Help 19. In the complex social relation that gave the commodity the way to prison, where the communist rendered you so with whom we arouse the desire for living intimacy to restore positive content that be based on anticipating unthinkable solidarity, love for both sense, the attic limit of our current economy, the most vulnerable points for an obstacle, but diplomas and extension. Informed by logic, builder, informed by dues, and her possibility theories, the negative community yield formulations, tropes, constructed ideals to counter the originated nature, negative absence, fight, poetic and poetry, that promises participating in the real move by which follows the present stage thing by liberty, imagination, desire, the non-relational relation, allegorical form of commodity, and requires another logic of increase on a fall creative capitalism metaphysics. Mark the card at capitalism's metaphysics. Parentheses, mischaracterization. We are not a monolithic rejection of anything of state identity. Instead, we ask the question to disrupt this assumed inevitability of structures of power and meaning as a prerequisite for movement building, which justifies perm to both. The revolution is an undercommons means the alt fails without the app that's will do cinema in 12. What do you do with unconscious that appears to hate you, and the conscious space that hates you, conscious delegation, or the conscious piece lacking so determined zone at you ideal, how do we fix it both? Fix the way we do in the disease psychoanalysis much more accurate and thorough understanding guidance to you ideal position your part. How do you do that one there? Not interest that I'm not either doesn't mean I'm not interested in something. What is the absence of the ego ideal? Its features, qualities. How does it exist? I think the only card I didn't read, wait. Yeah, I didn't read the BFO evidence, but I read everything else.
Okay. All right. Starting now. So what exactly did that minute of poetry you read do to challenge labor?
So it challenged the notion that the speech has a productive function that has to be interpreted in a uniform way. That I lost what, like a minute of my speech to reading poetry, which like strategically is maybe not the vibe, which I am very much aware of considering I didn't finish the BFO evidence, right? But that wasn't the point. The point is not to do something productive. It's not to do something that is like in relation to strategy. It is to do something that is life, that is sociality, that is connectivity, that is affect. And so I did lose a minute of my speech to reading poetry, but I enjoyed reading it, and I thought the poems were kind of cool.
So, like, just zooming out, you have a planetary extinction impact. What's the time frame for that destruction, and how does the 1AC reconcile that with the poem?
Okay, you think I can take this?
Yeah, you should take it.
Yeah. So our argument isn't necessarily that like voting aft stops extinction, but it's a question of rather how we think of debate, given that there's this inevitable extinction that's happening, because what we do in this round has no effect, it has no ability to effectuate whether that extinction happens or not. So we think that in this world where it's this kind of inevitable thing that's kind of happening in the backdrop, that the more important thing to do, rather than trying to think about how we can like endlessly mobilize ourselves in a kind of fatalistic way, instead of that, we should be thinking of ways we can form sociality within debate and within our lives. And also probably outside of debate as well, because we think that's probably the more important project. And we think that the kind of poesis we advocate at the top of the 2AC as an example of what like logisticality debate could look like as a way of like refusing that kind of productivity. It's a better way to conceptualize sociality debate.
Okay. And so, Kate, did you write that poem?
No, I did not write that poem. I didn't write either of them.
Okay, so how is reading somebody else's account of identity not a form of evidence reproduction within a debate space, which is like kind of the link on case
is it an account of identity?
What?
Why is the poem an account of identity?
Because you're using the poem as a way to access that idea of anti-sociality or individualization.
Why
If
is
it's
that about
not
individual
particular or
identity?
it's not working to form some basis of identity within this round, how is that not just a regurgitation of knowledge?
So I think that that requires the idea that I was communicating for the sake of like transmitting a message or relaying information, or that like you need to like flow the words of the poem and understand the arguments I'm making. And that would probably be all the things I'm saying, but that was a moment of like affect, like, you know, joyous experience, performance, creation. And in that way, I am like experiencing a relation to the person who wrote the poem. I'm experiencing a relation with people in the round.
What exactly is the mechanism that you use to dislodge the settler rhythm if you don't spill up out of round? What use is the ballot in this
I
case?
think that the settler rhythm operates as a protocol within spaces like debate that demand this kind of synaptic labor. We think the way that we are performing this round is a refusal of that.
Okay, I'm taking prep starting now. 8 minutes, right?
I believe it would be 10, right? Because it's college rounds.
Oh, would it be
It's
10?
now. Aw.
Yeah, it can be 10.
Okay, cool. 10 minutes starting now. Stop prep. I have 6:10 left. I'm gonna set up my speech stand and then send out the document. So the order is just going to be topicality.
Cool. Give me 1 sec to write these comments.
Phew. That was a lot of prep.
How much was it?
I'm pretty sure we had 6:10 left. I'll send that in the chat as well. Okay, is everybody ready?
Sorry, I'm not. Just give me 1 quick sec.
Okay.
Let me. It's just framework, right?
Just framework.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Right, whenever you're ready, just say so.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Just give me 1 sec. Sorry for the time. I'm just trying to remember a name for these objections. Okay. Yeah, whenever you're good.
Okay, Jeremy and Kate, are you two ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Okay, cool. Negatives shouldn't be burdened with rejoinder against affirmative that don't defend an instrumental defense of the United States federal government, substantially increasing prohibitions on anti-competitive business practices by the private sector. This does not require the use of any style or evidence, only that the topic determines the debate's subject matter. If the affirmative is not predictable, T must be prior because the negative couldn't meet the burden of rejoinder. The object of the affirmation's criticism is not fixable by the ballot's validation, but a negative ballot can act as a remedy for procedural violations. The ballot only solves our offense, so you can vote negative while agreeing with the 1AC. The research paradigm that allows for rigorous testing is grounded in the resolution. Refining an argument doesn't just refine content. It also teaches the process of focused research and nth-level testing. That's the only transferable skill inside and outside of debate. Think about why one side may or may not be wrong is a prerequisite to convincing others of what you think. If their position is well established, you will win, and debaters will learn about it. Even if you think that the app is correct, having debaters come to that conclusion through clash allows for argumentative refinement and nuanced advocacy. No theory debate is complete without considering competitive incentives. As strategy always rears its head. So even if the topic has transformative potential, you should assume that debaters run to uncontestable moral truisms. The only check the negative has against that is its ability to prepare in advance under a stable topic. That turns case. Only iterative testing access the value of strategies used to fight capitalism and access the undercommons. The mechanism we choose for resistance may be flawed because it hasn't undergone contestation. The only way to change epistemology has to be okay with being wrong. And the debate is really good because facilitating that when you're forced to be by topical constraint to be a little bit wrong all the time. Next is sabotage. They drop sabotage from the 2AC. In-depth debates over state action transforms debate into a training ground for tactics for infiltration by speaking the language of power. Only debates centered around the state action provide education for strategies and infiltration. This process reveals weak points within institutions and enables us to find blueprints for political organization. Learning about the fragility of the executive power, the legitimacy of American Congress and international law lets activists identify weak points and tactics that state agents use when they try to infiltrate radical movements. And knowing how the enemy operates is a prerequisite. The impact is micro-political sabotage. Learning to step on a mask and defend the indefensible combats capitalism. Saying that strategies of trigger against the government is crucial to developing a sustainable coping and thriving communities of people of color. The counter-interpretation, two responses. One is arbitrary. There's no Brentlander. Interpret lets the absolutely defend. Secondly, you choose what to talk about, which monopolizes the moral high ground and erases clash by evacuating any stable controversy. There's also nothing in terms of poetry that opens up a space for different folks to engage with the topic. They can read poetry under our interpretation too. Second is that it links to our offense. Any KF can pick and choose different parts of the resolution. Removing the obligation to defend the entire topic creates a slippery slope, justifying an infinite amount of absent potential interpretations. The 2AC2 is the Mullen 15 card. There's no link. The clash isn't about refinement. It requires some stasis for a controversy to occur, which allows for the deepest levels of testing, analysis, and debate that occurs between the affirmative and the negative. The one is straining against normative models of topical research isn't radical, but it doesn't require the negative to have the burden of rejoinder against it. T is theorism, microfascism. This T isn't violent. Debates of voluntary activity. By submitting to the rules of debate, you internalize debates regulatory nature. There's very little difference between the resolution speech times and now clipping pairings and a winner and a loser. There's the alternative is no limits at all because any counter-interpretation replicates macro-fascism to some extent, i.e. that if you're not forced to read poetry under their interpretation, you will lose. That evacuates all debates productive potential because debaters will resort to pre-existing inclinations over refined engagement. The affirmative doesn't solve. There's transgression. It sustains debate norms because radical content is meaningless, absent disruptive form, fosters net more micro-fascism. And creating a plan links. Debaters will grow discouraged over their inability to reshape debate. They link. They hold the macro-fascist rules and norms of debate like speech time, tournament guidelines, etc. They just choose to break the resolutional norm to gain a competitive advantage. There's no meaningful distinction between what they would sacrifice, between what they do and what is revolutionary. They would sacrifice the ballot for breaking rules. They also willingly participated in this debate where they knew that we were going for firm. They voluntarily subjected themselves to microfascism if they were right. This is also essential because it equates particular identities with arguments. Kind of the saying black debaters run Afropes, trans debaters run queer or white debaters run plans. Not only does that breed more community polarization, it's just problematic logic. The implication is that an Asian person who wants to discuss policy solutions is insistent as having, as for example, having internalized racism. There's no right. They participate in disclosure and speech time. They'll be mad if they win the flow and you give us the ballot. That proves the arbitrariness of saying that X identity cannot do X, Y, Z. Not only does that limit the experience of other debaters, it also includes an untenable and tautological standard that becomes impossible for the judge to evaluate because it forces an investigation into the personal identity of college debaters. Debate is bad. If 2AC4 was subject formation, debate is a bad space with variety. Subject formation, competitive incentives corrupt subject formation, makes the ballot to force our subjects to be open up to affirmation or negation in every single debate. The only model that makes sense given the nature of competition is one of idea testing. Switch debates shouldn't require defending horribly unethical ideas. Saying that we should increase antitrust laws isn't intrinsically awful. 2AC5 was the course of diplomacy. This have no link. We aren't imposing a normative rule onto them. We're just saying that the AF must do what the AF must do to provide rejoinder for the negative is, and they fail to meet that interpretation. Limits aren't violent. They just define what the affirmative can or cannot read. But even if the affirmative can read this affirmative, they just you vote negative because we are a pig out of the topical affirmatives. 2AC6 was bad skill creation. Three frames to guide this argument. First is that it's non-unique. People will do bad things after debate, regardless of what kind of arguments they make or not make, and tons of arguments prove that. But this means that clash is unique offense because it trends debate towards presenting proposals that have been subject to rigorous testing. Only our interpretation process research into proposals that teaches self-reflexivity. Their interpretation makes skill creation worse because it elevates the strategic value of insulating your ideas from creation. Secondly, is that TV and switch sides solves, even if they can't solve the app. They prove that debate is possible over their theory, which is their internal link to making debate better. They haven't not contextualize these specific skills we solve to broader violence, only we have impacted them to self-questioning in the context of clash. That internal link outweighs any vague reason why debate would be used badly. This is close at all or negative. Debate is violence progressive, so amplifying skills across the board and likely to reduce violence. So we see some with KVK debates are good. They can't solve our offense. Revolution versus revolution debates are revolutionary because their arguments are contrary to what's expected. That is the link to predictability. Negative will be placed in a reaction position, which forces more extreme policy position taking, which reduces the nuance of analysis by incentivizing reductionist positions. Like poetry is good. Secondly, is that argumentation bolsters revolutionary debates. Demands for change are a floor, not a ceiling. TVA proves the affirmative, which will be later on the negative teams. Then they can pick out the action of the plan and criticize the theory that underpins the 1AC, which allows for method debates. Like thirdly, is that rev debates will never happen since there's no topic. There's a chance that both teams will research the same issue is almost zeros. The 2AC8 was the Gillens on page evidence. Gillens on page has no idea what they're talking about. Matthews 16. Gillens on page 1 vital is proof that American is an oligarchy. Research had a very serious question about this paper, both its funding and analysis. The latest scholarly critique suggests that ordinary Americans will win a substantial share of the time. America is imperfect, but it's probably an oligarchy. He's middle class wins half the time. Gillens on page will be targeted in 3 separate debunkings. Special researcher critiquing the paper found that Americans agree on the overwhelming majority topic, and the rich and middle class agree on 89.6% of bills. The difference is not statistically significant. It's hard to say that the rich are getting what they want, where the rich when we did not statistically different. The poor, middle class, and the rich agree on 80.2% of policies. Gillens on page R squared values of measly 0.076 policies move in tandem. And Gillens on page thinks reform is good and possible. Gillens on page 18. Stalin is the most undemocratic, but we haven't amended the Constitution before to establish civil rights. Abolish slavery has senators elected directly. Sufficiently strong part of the movement makes the Senate more democratic too. This is offense. Even at taking that full weight, Gillens on page in conclusion has never engaged in politics, hollows out organizing tactics necessary to challenge politicians. Lickman 14. Gillens on page concluded average citizens have no influence. Ordinary citizens partly to blame because they did not vote. Americans are not great. This is at the near bottom of democracy. So ordinary citizens have abandoned participation in grassroots movement. Politicians respond to mass mobilization of everyday Americans by civil rights and movements. Without a substantial person on the ground, people-oriented interest groups cannot compete against wealthy adversaries. Average Americans have felt to like things used by elites, although average Americans cannot match the economic power of the rich. Large Americans have modest contribution to finance super PACs that advance common interests if they vote and organize. Ordinary Americans cannot claim to weaken American democracy without challenging politicians. Advocacy skills is a bad metric. We're not gonna answer that because it's not advocacy. We're not going for advocacy skills. We're going for self-questioning. So the TVA, the USFG should trust bust Amazon. There's 2 offensive points here. First is that logistics, the system of calculation that sustains racial capitalism requires full control over a single market, full control over all flows of production, aka mastery over production, in order to maintain its extraction of labor, resources, people, and so on. By disrupting that process, of TVA would represent a path to removing one control by one logistical master, Amazon, over the one area of the economy, digital platforms, which has become a web, which has a bunch of effects on web traffic, resources access, because at prime prices all alternatives that go to rural or poor areas. Secondly, is that Jeff Bezos sucks. He went into space for 10 seconds, and in that 10 seconds, he made far more than anyone else on Earth. The TVA would be your first step to reining him, but it can lead to more steps to reining him in the future. There's 2 implications to this. First is that the affirmative isn't offense because the resolution does not exclude their scholarship. We don't need to win that it solves the after. The topical plan isn't exclusive within their research. Secondly, is that switch set debate is a better model. Negating what we affirm avoids one-sided monologues, while maintaining an equitable division of ground, which is the better rules of the discussion that they want. No we meet argument coming out of the 2AC. Basically game over because they can read poetry within the TVA.
Okay. Great. Oh, I'm frozen again. Lovely. I love all the random positions my face ends up in. All right. Open for cross.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah, I almost forgot there was cross-ex. Let me.
Okay, you say the topicality is prior. Prior to what?
Prior to evaluation of the 1AC.
Yeah. So are there not a million other things that are prior to the evaluation of the 1AC?
Sure, there can be. There's a vocab, for example.
So
But the topicality is a procedural argument, which means that prior to evaluating the desirability of the 1AC, you have to evaluate whether or not it is topical.
sure. Okay, so I'm not even you personally, has framework been read before in this way?
Yeah, sure. It has been read before.
All right. And you're debating a chaos. So what is this ballot solves thing? Like, what's the bright line? At what point has topicality been read enough times that people will stop reading chaos?
Oh, it's not the argument that people will stop reading chaos. Chaos are inevitable. But the argument is that, like, the ballot solves thing isn't an argument about what you do. It's an argument about what the negative must do to meet the rejoinder of the debate. So the
Okay,
verb
yeah.
negative is to provide rejoinder. You have not sufficiently proven us that we can do
So
that.
you've got caplings, specific caplings, and carded 1AC answers that are particularly critiquing Moten from the literature base that you're reading.
Yeah,
Clearly,
but that was because this debate was decided ahead of time. So we wouldn't have had those otherwise.
okay, but you did have those things. So
Sure.
what's the vibe with framework anyway then?
So
Why
framework
didn't you
is an
pull
argument-
another position from the camp files?
So framework is an argument about what arguments we can read against you.
Yeah.
So, it's not, so
Absolutely.
let me finish. It's
Sorry.
not an argument about sort of what you can read. It's an argument about what we can read. So ground loss is inevitable. That means that A, all ground is concessionary ground, dependent on the goodwill of the 2AC. That means that 2, like every single position that we can read is going to be like, you're going to have researched it more. So
Sure.
we're not going to be catching up to you.
Sure. Are you open to being wrong?
Am I open to being what?
Wrong.
Wrong?
Are you open to being wrong? You said the debaters need to be open to being wrong. So I'm asking if you are open to being wrong.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. And then what is a norm?
So a norm is just like a rule that debaters should follow, but there's different norms of debate, such as speech times, like tournament pairings, etc.
Yeah. So when you say should follow, why should debaters follow the norm, the rule, whatever you want to call it?
So debaters should follow the norms because tournaments would make no sense otherwise. Our argument isn't that you should follow, be topical. Our argument is that we shouldn't be burdened with rejoinder against an atopical af.
Okay, sure. That's about time. One more.
Phew. No prep. There's a few new cards, so I'll just send it as a little file. Okay. The order is K case. Those cards are for the K, and let me know when everybody's ready and I'll start.
You said K case.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody ready?
One quick sec, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Starting. Now, overview. The K turns in our ways case the standard of that the one teach policies and antisocial are subject to value capture located has been within a culture something like a practice of accounting of material power that enables elites to tailor political demands in accordance with liberal representation locks in capitalism. None of their link defense or identity politics or co-option arguments applies because it fails to take into account how gamification of debate in a broader universe extracts value even from supposedly resistant politics. That was Tower 20, and the refusal of political mobilization targeting the state and civil society locks in neoliberal capitalism, catastrophic climate change, and more foremost task of the political left should be the development strategy to retake state power to break down capital. That was Privity 15, and it's a try or die for the alt resisting capital is necessary to avoid environmental destruction and inequality that will lead to extinction. Robinson 16. The alternative is to build solidarity around a mass socialist movement. The individual politics fractures movements and fails to spread social or institutional change. That was Jessica Breed 15. Cross apply Robinson 16. That is specifically key for the alt because it's a try or die late capital reduces segregating large population to severely at the whim of multinational corporations, fomenting widespread social instability. The only hope of the world is fundamental economic change. That's Foster into McKinsey 1812. The realities of the human system based on the culture and massive armies of birds, 100 million makes the future set an imperative takes instituted by multinational means emerging economies also cheated on the past of China is now a continual massive protest. However, since the monopoly took capital world has been a greater part of humanity and property combining its profits one of the most powerful labor opportunities and increasing its opposition worldwide and regulators over what's probably on the global south imperative division are debating enforcing wide disparities in living conditions. Working people everywhere are increasingly suffering. The future of humanity is there to be one and all lives, and 99% of the solution will require the development of a new system. And the perm is spatial taxonomy to recapitalize and maintain active disruption as inherent radical lets them disavow their investments in neoliberal social formations and bypass and organize. That's read 2K. Human plus anybody one here to the program doesn't do it. A form of denial by redefining political expressions that deeply intrinsic and empirically radical enables a sleight of hand that appeals to support for radicals projects program by association, widely inflate the meaning or more modest conviction of action and be throughout representation, and make it avoid the critical self-awareness and appraisal of analysis and failure. The left was being liquidated before he saw the somebody federal table for strategic analysis to tag along with emotion that appears to somehow have a visually distorted has a maturity and might as well be as a presented capacity for prediction and illusions onto the behavior of the rational quite disputable and opportunity associated simply by the fundamental I mean, the law theorem, anything can mean anything if you simply the condition without meaning any complaint. And it's a compromised politics that claims the fantasy of continuous growth. Only the end of capitalism can avert catastrophe. That's the bracket out 20. So the transition to capitalism incompatible denial of the fallacy. There is no alternative relative to species of the break of decision. We have been so committed to believing that capitalism is ensuring the claim that it leads to ignore the dangerous human efforts made our system resilient. The compromised position is everywhere. The environment is dirty to the economy. Nowhere do the answers to the economy be driven by continuous growth solutions depend on tech and ignoring the environmental impact of development is to save your tech and fake the fossil fuels for emissions that is offered by the obvious solution reducing consumption. Green investment are counterparts of the profits of COVID-19 created billions to do well. Let's will invest in green projects that they can amass money financing Drew financial aid is flawed. Inequalities are entrenched. It happened because greed little has changed, but the card had changed. And going back to like this general root cause argument, this is irrelevant when you're now analyzing how we should come together to fight against dominant structures. Even if you look at it from a who is right in terms of the starting point, you have to look at it from whose methodology is best for evaluating date, and that's going into the Soto 10 card. Evaluate this date with the goal of making a revolution the only role for intellectuals in the face of capitalists produce knowledge that affords revolutionary pilots. Any other role feeds back in the maintenance of capitalism by eschewing poetry and causes. That's South Help 10. Communism been linked to the previous state of manifestation of upstate capital, reclaiming a new thing of organizing the genuine communist heritage while opposing purity, oppression, and war and influence, freedom, democracy, freedom, and love. Communism and the enemy and coming to a neoliberal fascist regimes. Communists have been murdering their millions of the breakup upon it. It's a dangerous time to challenge those who seek to curtail critical debate. While they defend an order that is terroristic, academic strategy and investments have been forced by students who work outside the university learning about the movements, cut the card at movements. And I'm going back to like this mobilizing process. The way that poem did absolutely nothing to mobilize a movement within the debate space. We did that. There's really no way that the perm can work. Going back, you can cross by the cards I just read, but also the very idea that polices that poem that Kate read for that 1 minute does absolutely nothing to spur any of us to be anti-capitalist. Now going on to case. They can see the majority of the case flow and answer it only with their theory of politics, but does not answer any of the offensive arguments on this flow. You vote neg or presumptive, extended the one and see lacks a clear methodology, structural impacts, gun results in turn. Their case, he didn't answer the burnout arguments, but you should give it full weight. Burnout in this context is an individualization impact. The process of individualization without work leads to commodification under the academy that ratifies the capital and leads a halt to production while dominant powers learn to infiltrate their undercommons. And even then that constant need to perform their own identities leads to burnout from an internal standpoint that guts any sort of movement formation, including on the alternative. And two, extend the burden of proof academic efforts are already planned through debating in the status quo. They have no intrinsic benefit to reading out within the debate, and thus no reason to affirm the strategy. Even the fact that that wasn't Kate's actual poem, that was just a poem that Kate pulled from who knows where, is just assert that there is an intrinsic burden of proof, and that activists have already been doing that within the debate space, and it did absolutely nothing to change for large. And this labor DA is irrelevant when you evaluate it from the standpoint of that they don't do anything to spill up materially. And that was the next argument of case, that the planning doesn't spill up, and that competition means that you ally yourself with people who vote for you, alienate those who are forced to debate against you, and that ensures failure of the movement. If anything, they are the implication of labor, even the fact that that wasn't your poem, that was just a piece of evidence that you read within this debate. In order to act as a ballot means that you don't spill up, and you're just creating even more fragmentation through your creation of competition. And they said that doesn't need input, but this space that they're advocating for doesn't exist. They admitted that they don't spill up, and so that under common formation, by them conceding that they don't have any sort of spill up, they don't lead to under common formation anything. They just lead to commodification. But in the academy, because this debate is more so a space for movement formation, if you don't use it for movement formation, you're just using it as a way to access the academy and let them commodify the very structures that we're trying to fight against. And that turns gays because it, again, lack of ties, race, strength, power, else workers along.
Could you send the marked version of the cards?
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you send it? Oh, it is there. Thank you. Okay. So I'm putting 10 minutes on the timer and I'm starting that now. Yeah. I stopped prep. We have 340 left. It's going to be case and then framework and then cap. Let me just make sure I have the right flows. So is everyone here and or ready?
Here and ready.
Case, framework, cap is what you said.
Yes. What the hell is the file I just had open? Not that one. That one. Okay.
Wait, sorry. Before you start the 1AR, can I go use the restroom?
You want what?
Can I go use the restroom?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to do the same.
Same.
Look, I needed a water break for the past hour.
Cool. Vibing. Oh, I'm frozen again. Oh, that's such a pain. How are the vibes, everyone? Hi, everyone. I think I just mean Jeremy. That sounds like everybody else dipped.
Yep.
Yeah. After this round, I'm gonna finish the 1AC.
Sounds
is-
good.
Yeah,
Sounds
that is
good.
it. Yep. Yeah. Oh God.
Hi, I'm back.
Okay.
Is Kate gone as well?
Uh,
Nah, I'm
Maybe.
right here.
Oh.
My video's being like however it's being, so I've kind of given up on not having a frozen video feed, but who knows?
All right.
I'm back.
so is everyone here now? Looks like it. So yeah, there's like an overview on top of case, presumption arguments, framework, cap. And I'm starting now. The antisocial construct structures antitrust enforcement investment into the system of governance and oppression are forced and exported outward into an omnicidal project that can only operate through making our relationship with language and the state static and measurable, which is why we affirm logisticality as a way of disassembling the logistical subjectivities within debate. Our reading of poetry in the 2AC is not only in round solvency, but also serves as an example of what relationality could look like, because poetry's refusal of static meaning allows us to reorient our relationships to the antisocial contract and change the conditions by which like these spaces operate. Now, the impact is omnicide because running of all life productive necessitates those violent forms of specialization from racist violence to environmental destruction and attempt to maximize mastery and profit over the world. On the presumption arguments, first is that the clarity is irrelevant because the app is about opening up spaces for material organizing, which is a prerequisite. They've conceded numerous examples from the 2AC, i.e. that the undercommons is a prerequisite to things like Stonewall, the Salsa Soul Sisters, and Take Back the Night. The French Revolution had salons, the Haitian Revolution had the mines in the mountains and the fields now, which proves how our undercommon way of relating to one another is necessarily a prerequisite to any kind of spill up or out of this activity. Second is that there's no link to these kind of Verno individuation arguments because the app is an attempt to disassemble the individuated subject that they critique, which means that we solve their kind of burnout arguments. I'll also extend the labor dissat here. Now, why their whole entire presumption argument revolves around this idea that it is our burden to do things like spill outside of this round or to provide things like policy, education in the context of framework. But these are things outside of our means and control, which means you should only be avowing the kinds of things that we can actually actualize our agency within things like the round, i.e., the form poesis, rather than things we can't actualize and must like the alternative, which I'll get to later. Framework. Our interpretation of the debate should defend a poetic interpretation of the resolution, allowing us to reevaluate the resolution in a more embodied way, just as our relation to debate and the anti-social contracts based on the affective investments in it, so too is our relationship to the state and debate writ large. This frames your ballot because our model of the game is the only one worth playing because it creates skills that can contextualize politics and how the anti-social contract is activated in our daily lives. All other competition framing becomes irrelevant if we win that, because only our model of game is worth playing as education outweighs things like competitive incentives in the version which produces worse people. And also our interpretation solves things like KVK debates and Rev debates better than theirs can, because the topic remains as a stasis point, just like our one is about the nature of monopoly formations as they are attached to things like anti-blackness. There's enough of a stasis for clashing. It's proven by the fact that Neg has links for cap and specific case answers. Don't let them get away with these hypothetical, in other rounds, their model debate and the abstract arguments. Make all their offense be contextualized to the specificities of this round. I'm also going to extend the conceited omnicide dissad that is devastating for them. Their imposition of static and unified definitions of the resolution is rooted in the desire to make all things measurable for the purpose of control. Logistics can only operate through destroying alternative meanings in the way of being that don't adhere to it, i.e. their creation of arbitrary limits makes the only relevant discussions one that are predicated off of state thought and macro political structures, which kills our ability to strategize against it. The impact is colonial thought. They train debaters to adhere to the project of the omnicide and rhetorical space that produce debaters like Karl Rove to export their models and their models of colonial interpersonal bond. It turns their arguments about sabotage, because we're the only ones with the theory of how assimilation to state politics and the language of power corrupts our action within these spaces. Also takes out limits because their ability for limits to exist in a space is an arbitrary delineation that's always made to fit into logistical norms of the anti-social contract. Also takes out fairness because it turns them a tool to cut out any radical subversive project on account that it creates unproductive debates producing factory line thinkers. Now we're also not going to go for the empiricism but you can extend the K of Western technocratic rationality onto the intuitive testing standard. The idea that an argument must be tested begs the question of who writes the test and what kind of answer they're looking for. Apps like ours will never be testable or tested enough because framework is not a matter of testing, but rather serves as a litmus test for who is normal, who's ethical, who's productive enough to exist in this space, which is internally to our anti-blackness arguments. And on the switch side and TVA arguments, you can all cross by the offense I did above is both don't answer the fact that we are impact turning thinking through states as sites of political change. It's uniquely true in the concept of switch sides, it kills the opportunity for KVK debates to occur. It's uniquely good because it creates discussion about different ways to resist colonialism, and their model destroys the opportunity for it. It's also true for the TVA because as combining embodied poetry with instrumental policy actions antithetical to our political project poetry. Refusal static meaning cannot be paired with the creation of policy and planning, which is a manifestation of homicide codification into a means of colonial domination. Also, this just isn't a TVA of the app. It's a topical app, and they've tried to instrumentalize parts of our advocacy in order to kind of force policy into it, which is a double turn. Onto the cap debate. Top level framing issue. They have not sufficiently contended with our theorization of capital. Their analysis of neoliberalism is incomplete without consideration of the ways in which capital has become racialized, starting from the point of dialectics and class obfuscation, the way the capital is produced via the afterlife of slavery and how it's become logistical capitalism. Harney indicates the assembly line of modern capitalism comes about from the regulatory mechanism that were developed for the chattel slavery and through the desire to master and render all things productive. Focus on parties and mass mobilization, not the destruction of capitalism, but a recreation of the desire to control that marks the afterlife of slavery, dooming their strategy of failure. It means that the acts of the prerequisites we need a space of revolutionary planning. Historically, the undergrounds have been materially successful instead of revolutionary potential. You can cross by the examples from the case made, and there's a no link argument that should filter how you evaluate the permutation because the app is not a monolithic rejection of all forms of movement building, i.e. the Parenti evidence, but rather one space for planning and relationality, one survival strategy that we can generate ideas and strategies. And this also justifies our permutation to each, because which you can cross by the labor DA as a net benefit, because we cannot and should not be held accountable for other people's movements. Let them protest, but tell me why that implicates our strategy. It's not, it doesn't, but this is a form of labor shifting that leads into victim blaming, leads to burnout and Dex movement, which they all failed without the app, and they've mishandled the Wilderson and Moden argument. I don't even know if I'm pretty sure they dropped it. Their understanding of political man is a misreading of the app. We can't be subsumed by value capture because we're not a refusal, but an unmasking, a disassembly of structures, which is a prerequisite to alternative solvency. Only we can theorize how we can actualize these kind of movements from debate as a starting point. There relies on this notion of fiat in the external world, which is a double turn, the value capture argument.
Okay, we have 6:10 left, starting now. The order is going to be K at the very top, T, and case.
Say that one more time.
Yeah, it's going to be the critique, the topicality argument, and finally case. Let me get my stand set up. Okay, is anybody not ready?
You said cap KT case.
Yeah, and so yeah. Okay, is anybody not ready? Cool. On the K, we'll kick the alt. We're not going for it, but their offense here doesn't matter. On topicality, T does not limit what the app can say. Instead of there's a burden of rejoinder that they must meet to win the debate. They don't get to weigh the app. That's like condo versus nuclear war. Debatability comes before substance. Moral truism filters the ballot, even though they outweigh on mere magnitude. It's just as likely that they're winning an argument because we weren't prepared to engage it. We are adjudicating between competing models of debate, not against external racism or capitalism. There's two impacts here. First is clash. Truth is a product of debating, not something determined prior to the round. This is proven by the fact that you want to vote for who wins the flow, not only do individual arguments not reflect your personhood, i.e. you vote for arguments that you don't believe in, and team three philosophers who disagree, but that structure of this investment generates self-reflexivity. Clash is a necessary prerequisite to reading embodied poetry. Think about one side may or may not be wrong as a prerequisite to convincing others of your method. Only the iterative process of preparation and clash required by our model of debate allows debaters to discern their opponent's best arguments and research second and third level defenses on their own. Doing so forces us to think about, to learn how to come to conclusions, solidify your positions, and analyze the opportunity cost of an action. That turns case self-questioning over predictable point of stasis that are unique to our point of debate, and then they're necessary for us to challenge injustices. Second is sabotage. Our Leon evidence isolate three internal links, and we need all three to access the full weight education around some versus strategies. First is state engagement. Infiltration requires working within and debating about current institutional arrangement, which allows debaters to learn to speak the language of power and identify weak points to attack an institutional structure. Second is switch side debate. We have to switch sides frequently, defend arguments that we don't believe in to become saboteurs, because sabotage requires persuading people to do the thing that you don't believe in. Their model can't solve because they stake out the same position every round, making it difficult to slip on a mask and trick people. Third is predictable clash. We need to well prepared and in-depth debates over strategies of sabotage to build credible blueprints. Ground that we could have read isn't predictable because the app is not grounded in the resolution. The counter-interpretation, 2AR, one was the counter-interpretation. The first argument is that they can literally read embodied poetry under our interpretation too. There's no reason why they can't. Secondly is that they dropped it as arbitrary and that there's there's nothing unique to poetry which allows marginalized folks to engage with the topic, which takes out their static offense. Thirdly is that it links to our offense. Any KF can pick and choose part of the resolution, which creates a slippery slope, justifying an infinite number of apps, which might as well be no limits at all. 1AR2 was concessionary ground. Any ground is concessionary and unpredictable, which doesn't solve clash. First, that ground isn't evident as of the 1AC. The app has to grant the negative permission to get linked, which leaves them one step behind. Predetermined preparation is impossible because you can't determine what the app will defend, but the app can strategically over-prepare for a few positions while leaving you in the dark. That undercuts procedural equity, but it also flips their offense, prevents rigorous clash over critical positions by discouraging debaters from engaging those positions, those literature bases at all. For example, it prevents debaters from reading into poetry. Secondly, is that it's also bad ground. Their model incentivizes a race to the moral high ground and turns advocacy in the truism, which makes acts smaller and leaves negative with nothing to say in response. 1AR3 was the opposite. They said I answered this in some information, but debate is a competitive activity in which we can test arguments that aren't tied to our own subjectivities or social positions. Our interpretation is that the app should defend a reduction Our interpretation is that the negative should have the burden of rejoinder, and the app should provide that burden of rejoinder. Making such arguments doesn't mean that you have to believe in them, nor does it trick you to think that the state is good. They can play bad people in debate for the rules of debate itself. Reading a plan does not shape one's morals character, but rather self-reflexively internal link turns. They cement the argument by splitting the community into policy and K teams. There's only within debates research paradigm that debaters are forced to change their minds in confronting unfamiliar literature bases. The TVA, which is the Trust Plus Amazon, resolves all of their offense. It provides an inroad to the resolution, and net better for both sides to engage, providing inroads for the discussion of the logistics because the logistics require full control over all flows of production, aka mastery over production, to maintain its extraction of resources and labor. By disrupting that process, the TVA creates paths to removing control from Amazon. If your only exposure to this topic is finding ways to critique or avoid it, then you become solely capable of preaching to the choir. Debate is unique because it gives opportunities to inhabit other perspectives without actually enlisting in those causes for the sake of idea testing. Because of the limited nature of the topic, the same debates occur again and again, forcing the negative to research new answers via argumentative innovation. T turns case. That means that it results in a better process for advocacy refinement. Using the 1AC as a reason for why the topic is bad generates more in-depth clash on both their theory and their method. Affirmative teams should be able to leverage the case and do impact comparison by reading it on the app makes it impossible for us to generate offense against it. But it's just only the same education and research practices that the 1AC does, but it still gives both teams an equitable opportunity to win. So only argumentation can strike a middle ground. Finally, they dropped the ballot pick at the top of the 2NC flow. The ballot pick just says that to vote for us to remedy procedural violations of the arguments, but don't vote for them because okay, don't vote for them because they don't give us a burden of rejoinder to disprove the affirmative case. The 1EC is not offense against topicality. We don't have to win that the resolution is good, only that it's a debatable proposition. Every argument they've made in this debate is negative ground under our model of debate. We don't need to win if poetry makes debate accessible to minorities, because if the threshold for voting affirmative is that, then there shouldn't even be a debate about these things. Otherwise, people, there's nothing static about poetry. What is in-round solvency? If clarity is irrelevant, then how do you solve for omnicide? You need a goal. Otherwise, people won't join up with your vibes, only movement, unless it results in something violent, such as supporting it like Israel, the settler state. Otherwise, the affirmative does nothing but analyze the resolution and plan ahead for the Haitian Revolution, or the I don't know, the examples that they gave in a 1AR. There's no labor that is invalid because the negative doesn't make a normative statement on what the app should do. Just that the app must meet the burden of rejoinder. That means that they don't have to read a topical affirmative. They just have to give us a burden of rejoinder, which is not sufficient in this debate.
Okay. Case then framework. All right, one second. I have to shuffle all of my various like screens and things. Okay. And that should be like that. Okay, just gotta stand up. Oh. This. Why is this cap? Did not go for cap. All right. Is anybody not ready? No? Okay, cool. Wait. That was really anticlimactic. I need to pull this up. I'm sorry, I have a very weird setup with my mouse. And when I move it, it goes in the opposite direction when I'm standing on this side of my computer, the whole thing. But anyway, we got it. All right. Is anybody not ready? Cool. So deeply sorry that the negative didn't like my poem, or maybe that they didn't find it strategic, but I enjoyed reading it, and maybe I hope that someone enjoyed listening or not. Who knows? Affective performance, like all other things, is an exercise in active nihilism. I'll do what I find life affirming, but we must understand that there can be no ethical investment in the imagined future I may or may not have created. My question is, would you call this poetry or an overview, or maybe both? We cannot and will not be held to the language of empire, the grammars of coloniality, to the formation of the sovereign subject as citizen, the glorification of the ego ideal as subject and agential capacity. The app carves out our space for external theorization and histories of refusal, like the Black Panthers, Pink Panthers, the Haitian Revolution, and Take Back the Night. It proves that Philip is not only likely but historically warranted. And we're going for the arguments that we've made about omnicide and subject formation, in which individuals are required to perform in a normative and intelligible way, which leads to psychological violence and genocide of those who cannot or will not assimilate. The basis of imperialism and the justification for dehumanizing violence, which outweighs their like clash and fairness impacts. And you should have a high threshold for voting on the TVA or their interpretation, because the 2NR leans on disembodiment good, which is the internal link to our omnicide arguments, disembodied forms of debate where everything is productive and instrumentalized to hold on to its place, and around is a symptom of logistics in which everything is an object that can be used in embodied attachments via relations like poetry are the only way to solve this. Omnicide frames your ballot as the most important impact that can be weighed in this debate, because it not only shapes monopoly formation, but how we come to understand and relate to it in discursive activities like debate and analysis of omnicide calls attention to the ways that logistics of anti-blackness and capitalism justify and cause neoliberal violence or investments in them. Better explains the way that violence has evolved in line with military technology, because debate isn't yet another chokehold of logistical capital. We need an analysis of violence that calls attention to the ways that capitalism is made different. This means that even if they win, they're framing you still vote negative on omnicide through the destruction of all alternative ways of life and living. Logistical capitalism become a Death Star that has ripped apart the world through accumulation and colonialism. This process required dispossession and extermination of all types of life that refuse to be an interface for racial capitalism, which means that you err affirmative on all the questions of value, because all opposition to how we understand what lives can be livable and sustainable have been systemically targeted and destroyed, which is something that you can cross-apply onto the TVA and switch side debate. They say that nothing is static. We're impact turning static relationality to the ballot, and analysis and planning in the undercommons is our solvency mechanism. And the resolution isn't normative intrinsically, but it's normative as soon as you read framework, which means it's an internal link turn. Framework proper. The TVA is great. I love it. Why don't you read it as your app so that if it's so incredible, extend that it's a topical app, but not a topical version of our app. Abolishing Amazon doesn't abolish logistics. Instead, they've instrumentalized what they view as the key version is the 1AC, which is a link to the omnicide argument, and also means that their model can never solve for our offense because it requires an other to be fetishized, made productive, and co-opted. They leave the good parts and correct the bad ones. And the counter-interpretation solves that we should be allowed to have the affirmative should be allowed to have the poetic relationality of the resolution, because it solves for Rev debates and KVK debates by maintaining the resolution as a flexible stasis point they can't access the offense, because you're not just a reading of poetry, but the having a poetic relation, which is something that is never static. To attach a poem and read a policy app is an instrumentalization, which is the internal link to the omnicide impact from cases outweighs any arguments they've made, and is the closest proximity to your ballot. To vote negatives to embrace a politics of instrumentalization. To vote affirmative is to affirm life and the undercommons. But what should the negative do? Well, in this case, any one of the number of pre-cut camp files would have been fine, along with CAP, which they read and had links to. The TVA is the counterplan of terms for CAP: productivity, futurity, humanism, an alternative theory of labor, capital, race, productivity, humanism, or value that satisfies the burden of rejoinder, which means that even if you give them top-level framing claims, you still vote AFSM. We're going for the labor DA. Their offense has not been sufficiently contextualized to surround all the various forms of movement and argument that they've mentioned, not trade off with the AF. There are hundreds of policy rounds every week, and they have no reason why this round is key to anything in particular. It's not our job to produce the knowledge that they want to interact with, which is an answer to the switch side argument as well. They never have to switch sides. And also an answer to the sabotage DA. There's no reason why this round is key to learning the internal mechanisms of the AF. But this is you can extend the KVK revolutionary planning argument. We will learn about the internal mechanisms of the state in other rounds, which means that their sabotage offense is non-unique, but there are not all that many teams reading chaos. This one in particular is essential to mobilize the undercommons, which is the unique benefit to reading poetry and poetic interpretations. And the impact of the labor DA is that we should not be held responsible to every movement ever, or to the actions of state or capital, that we should not have to instrumentalize ourselves, that we should be allowed to have small moments of survival strategies that are life affirming in a world where we are expected to be productive in every capacity, in a world that is so life denying. Anything else leads to movement failure, burnout, and psychological violence, as well as individuation, which turns our individuation arguments, i.e. we become disconnected from the idea that others are suffering in the same way as us, because it must be an individual the individual experience. Instead, the affective relationalities that we generate via poetry allow us to solve this, which is something else you can weigh against framework. And they've said that they're not a limit on what we can say, but whether or not we can win. But this is just come here and lose, as if there's no value to be had in understanding logistics, as if they have not used the ideology of omnicide to limit out that which they consider to be unpredictable. But who is writing the rules for normativity and for predictability? It is the people who control the levers of logistics. And they said they weren't ready to debate it and that they didn't have access to Clash, but first they had particular links. And I already read a ground list, but they say that self-reflexivity, that we need to be ready to be wrong, but they're not ready to be wrong. And if they are, then vote affirmative and prove them wrong. I already answered switch side debate. They say infinite apps. This is really non-unique, especially when they haven't given examples of apps that we allow. They also haven't answered the defensive argument, which is that we can maintain the resolution as a stasis point, which is why there is still Clash available to them and there's still predictable ground for them. They should have prepped out the answering like a Moten and Hardy K, which means that they can just read those answers on the negative. There's no reason why this isn't true. And the ballot pick, there's no warrant as to why this remedies procedural violation, but we have made a specific explanation as to how your ballot functions as a form of affective connectivity if you vote affirmative, which means that you don't have the proximity, or you don't have the jurisdiction to vote negative. You do have the jurisdiction to vote affirmative.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Good debate, everyone.
That's fun. I haven't given a 2AR in a really long time. I think it was a little messy though.
All right. So I have quite a bit of thoughts about this debate. I'll try not to rant too much. My preface for this is that I feel a little bad because some people I think have more comments under their document than others, but that's mostly just a factor of when prep time was happening and stuff. And I had time to write. So I kind of want to talk about in a global sense. So even if I'm addressing someone in particular, other people should feel free to jump in about particular ideas. As a meta frame, I have two comments that I think apply to everyone. The first is that people are not effectively utilizing an explanation of why debate is necessary for whatever they're defending, be that the affirmative, be that the articulation of the alternative in the 1NR, be that the kind of 2NR push on framework. I think that in each of these cases there is a lot of explanation for why maybe particular spill out claims, maybe there's some sufficiency question, but there's a lack of necessity kind of behind a lot of these claims. There's a lack of internal links, even when there is decent examples, explanation or warranting. Everyone in this debate is doing great on a lot of questions and a lot of warrants. There's a lot of second and third level claims that are being made. But there's a lot of places where you can get more specific and where you can center your offense in ways that is less redundant, which is like the number 2 point, which is that I feel like everyone is kind of doing their stuff everywhere and not centralizing it into digestible and adjudicatable kind of positions that make it easier for me to be able to parse through all the flows. Like I wouldn't really love to have to make a decision about this round for that reason, because I think that there's a little bit of talking past and just like a lot of missed opportunities. So I'll start at the top and kind of work my way down. Jeremy, the 1AC, you have a good reading voice. You do the correct thing, which is starting out kind of slow to allow me to get used to your voice. You're pretty clear during card text. However, I think you should be careful occasionally. Your clarity, I suffered from this a bit, makes it easier to tell when you make small mistakes in your reading. So like, no malice assumed or anything. This is a practice debate, whatever. But you missed a small line in the impact card, just like a short, like 7-word sentence. And there were a handful of words where it's like you're doing small changes, like changing the word regulation to violence, or like stuff that is clearly unintentional and like the result of you just trying to get through it. So I think you want to just be extra cautious. This might be a de-highlighting thing and just like trying to make sure you can get through it.
I think I just had like the document I was using was just like I'm not used to the way that Max like the zoom works, like everything's smaller. So I think if I just like increase the zoom a bit, I wouldn't have to strain my eyes like finding where I am as much, and that might resolve that.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally can get how like sometimes there can be like a small line that's like on the right side of the screen or something when you're finishing something on the left, or it looks like you already read it. Just emphasizing to be careful there. Your cross-ex answers were mostly good, but I think you need to re-emphasize a little bit more about your approach to the intramural of debate and subject construction. This is like my meta comment for the AF, which is that like it gets like, this happens on both sides, but it gets very blurry at times what people think debate has the capacity to do and what they think it does not, which is kind of demonstrated by different points where you variously like say like we're a prerequisite to organization, or where you say like, well, debate should only be a question of like the intramurality of how we relate to each other, the kind of habits that we form vis-a-vis like particular carceral methods, calling the police, etc.
If I could just like ask a question there. I've seen the word intramural thrown a lot while I've been at Debate Boutique, and I don't really get what that means.
Absolutely. Intramurality generally refers to the assumption that our interpersonal relations in debate, the way that we treat each other, the way that our arguments resonate beyond just like how we research them, but also how they cause us to internalize particular ideas, and how just like in a broad sense, it just refers to our activity. How do particular forms of violence get reified? How does research implicate how our community treats itself? Intramurality just means that like within a given social space, how do particular habits get formed? So Skycat, you have some decent 1AC questions. I think you could probably press slightly harder on the precise configuration of the AF's theory of power and how that trickles down into their advocacy. Like I said, that they need to kind of specify more what subject construction or the intramural means. I think that you need to recognize that that's a point of weakness for the AF, and it's a point of offense that all of the flows that you're going for, it depends upon nailing down early. You need to because they have a very different conception, at least conceivably, of what debate is capable of doing versus you, right? So at a point where you're going for things like either the kind of infiltration arguments vis-a-vis and or like learn the dark arts to defeat them kind of thing on framework, and on the CapK, like how we need to use debate as a revolutionary training ground, right? Like, so both of your kind of meta level organizing impacts require pushing on that question. So I think you need to develop some different ways of asking them about what is included and what is not included in the way that they do this stuff. Moving on, the 1NC, Faith, you're pretty clear I think that you are maybe, at least initially in the speech, going a little fast for your own good. I would, like I suggested with Jeremy, start a little bit slower, like this, like interpretation, the affirmative is like kind of like that. It gives you just like a bridge into it, especially with analytics and definition cards being the first thing that's getting read. Content wise in the 1 and C, I think that there's a little bit of tension that is not being exploited by the AF between the Taiwo evidence and the framework debate, given the gamification arguments that are made in terms of that piece of evidence. I think that that card is also maybe a little under highlighted compared to Parenti being a little over highlighted. Parenti ends up being more what that debate is about, but I think that it's possible to access most of the warrants in that card without really reading as many of them, considering it's really just like, come on, y'all, the state, we need it to stop climate change. It might be worth, I think in general, the neg is suffering from a problem with having every flow depend on the same structure of arguments. So if the affirmative wins that reform is bad, they beat every flow in the current configuration of how this works. The T arguments you could conceivably try to kick out of your infiltration stuff, but at the point where you read it, you're somewhat conceding that debate has an educational capacity to do things like engage in political spill out. And that is risky. I think that it is potentially better if you move those arguments to the case debate, and then you can have the case and the cap K be kind of where the engagement good debate happens to see the political stuff. And then you can kind of insulate framework by making it only about testability and only about proceduralism, which is harder to do when you kind of do infiltration in the same space. I think that the app needs to take advantage of that much more than you are, which is kind of an example of the not consolidating and like not strategically utilizing the kind of similarities across flows. Now, obviously that split will, I think, still implicate the contradiction I just mentioned between Taiwo and the framework debate. But I think that's a contradiction you're going to have to read and deal with inevitably if you're reading Taiwo. There might be ways of dealing with it by talking about how like organizational debates vis-a-vis the cap K are a potential solution. And you're doing at least some arguments about why like theorizations of identity are problematic in the way that you're utilizing them here. Let's see, in CrossX, Faith, you do a pretty solid job talking about the value capture argument, but I think that like against this affirmative, it needs to be less about like identity politics in a general sense and more so about how the particular ways that the affirmative imagines how resistant performances and kind of poetic modes of affect deriving from particular understandings of identity and marginalization, how that is what ultimately gets captured in particular neoliberal ways. So it's not just like what about identity in general, but how they utilize it and how it uniquely, in some ways gets distorted given the way that debate ultimately goes down. Like in what ways does certain forms of improvement reappear in the context of the 1AC? How do these contradictions serve a product of competition that they're trying to generate? Give me 1 second. I just have to respond to a text message and I will resume.
When you resume, I have a question about that.
Yeah, give me 1 quick sec. My partner is shopping at IKEA for a bed.
Ooh,
So
fun.
trying to give my
You don't have to
input.
sleep on the floor.
I did, it was terrible. Okay. Yeah, what was your question, Kate?
So if that argument was gone for that way, in terms of like more about the way that like the affect and poetics of the AF is captured, do you think that the pivot to the Moten and Wilderson card about like unasking the question is not something that can be captured because like a refusal versus an unasking, or do you think there's a different, more strategic way to answer that?
I'm a bracket Moten and Wilderson because I have a 2AC comment about that. But I think that there's a broader question about I feel that people are like on both sides are kind of misunderstanding where a lot of the offense vis-a-vis the K should be. This is a question about organizing and what role poesis and poetics have within that structure. I'll have more comments about this in a second, but I think that as a pushback to that, it needs to be more of a centering of some of the particular solvency warrants. I'm just going to bracket that because I'm going to talk about your 2AC in a second. I'm just trying to go chronologically. Yeah, I know that's only like half an answer, but I promise I will get to that. Similarly, Faith, a lot of these material action questions kind of beg a broader issue about like what organization needs to look like. I think that this K needs to be way more about talking about the usefulness of class politics and class as a science for base building, and the importance of debate as a unique place where we can contest these unique things, right? I mean, like thinking about it this way, right? So your alternative is about like mass socialist organizing. So I think that this is like relevant, right? Like right now, the 2021 like Democratic Socialist like convention is happening right now, and the amount and one thing that happens every single convention is there's never enough time to literally debate the issues. They end up getting debated in like very small insular cliques and friend groups through unique insular like article factories or certain publications like connected to different caucuses that have different ideologies. So in general, there is not a space right now where we are given the kind of time and effort to articulate the real material trade-offs that come when we are discussing things like class-based organizing, like literal questions like what is the boundary between how we materially spend resources for things like mutual aid versus things like electoral infiltration. What is the difference between issue-based campaigning? What issues are the most important? What relationships should be had with the state, right? These are the questions that debate has an opportunity to be a place where those can get genuinely hashed out, given that they are not in a public or kind of transparent way able to be debated in the current structure. Like the way that conventions go down is that they have like one or two debaters, like one or two people to kind of speak for or against each amendment or each resolution for a particular like, solution, like, should DSA do support independent tenant organizing is like one of the current things, right? And they'll just do like for, against, call the question, everyone votes, right? And that's not an in-depth debate. And debate has the ability to be a place where that occurs. And that's like a framework argument that should kind of frame the alternative, right? So the question of whether it's like the AF that does something versus whether the alt does something in debate inevitably gets both sides into a series of circles. It should be more about like, what is the trajectory if these kinds of ideas were universalized or carried outwards? How can they be utilized? So a clear answer will also help you on things like the climate change debate. The non-reformist reform cards might also be helpful here, at least in terms of articulating both a spill up methodology and more impacts and examples of what spill up could look like. Let me see. Who is doing prospects of faith? I think it was Jeremy. So I think, like I said, you do a decent approach recognizing the tension, Jeremy, between the first cap link and some of things on the flow, but I think you misdirect it by focusing it more on the alternative and less on the framework debate. I think you're right to kind of ask questions about like materialism and what that could include, but like how you all end up approaching this question gets kind of like mutated throughout the debate, where it's like, is it prerequisite to spill up? Is it that there is only the question of intramural relations, how we talk to each other in this insular space? Is is there some kind of difference where there's like a laterality to how subject construction works, such that it carries with us both in and out and dissolves the kind of border between the two? There needs to be a clear relationship to there, not just within cross-ex, but in a broader sense. The 2AC, I think it makes more sense for the poetry to be in the 1AC, but I understand why it exists where it does. I do get the idea, and I appreciate you kind of making certain arguments about why like its slightly less strategic nature is maybe a solvency argument, although paradoxically that kind of does buy back into like this question of its utility or its use value. I think that you should be thinking about this poetry stuff beforehand, which I think was a little bit evident from like you kind of thrusting it on Jeremy at the last second.
We like talked about it a little bit, but I didn't know we were like, I didn't know she had found poems and wanted to put them in the 1AC as of yet. I thought we were just like gonna roll with it for that, with the 1AC as is, but yeah.
I hear that. I think that there are,
Oh, sorry.
I think that there are ways of, I mean, the poem's fine. It's good, whatever. But I think there's ways of like the two questions in my mind are one, like, is the poetry truly an exemplification of some of the claims about logisticality in the undercommons, which I'm not sure I'm getting like the teasing out from that yet. I kind of understand the poem as like an indictment of capitalism. Like, I think that's true, but I don't know really what it gives besides that. There are ways of conceptualizing the existing tags, at least as relatively poetic, or changing them slightly in order to re-emphasize certain elements of poesis. I think that for me, like, poesis is also the semiotic re-articulation of existing words and signs. So for example, Moten's theory is poetry, but also like what I tried to do when writing the 1AC, at least like the first tag as a brief example, right, where like Moten starts with this very interesting kind of undermining of like the first theft like was rightful ownership, right? I try to do like the first anti-competitive business practice was business and competition, right? Because it allows for a kind of dislodging of the existing conceptions and rigidified notions of meaning that are asserted within the dominant framework of the resolution in a way that allows for a broader interrogation of what anti-monopoly practices assume at the level of the subject. So like, you know, thinking about it that way might be helpful, but like you can also still include other stuff. If you want to, the question about hope that was earlier in the debate, if you want to turn this in the more like almost Deleuzian line of flight question that you end up going to, a better argument might be like the shift from the question of hope to belief in a rereading of like the Deleuzian quote about belief in the world that's articulated in the first Undercommons book. It's either Moten or Halberstam that ends up talking about it. But I think that it's like a pretty interesting framing that might be a decent way of explaining hope against hope. Otherwise, you might not want to wed yourself to Deleuze in particular. Lines of Flight it uniquely opens you up to a lot of king offense that is uniquely about that and might be a little bit complicated and something that the 1AC doesn't have a built-in defense of. I think I like that the 2AC and like a lot of your overviews, Kate, have their own voice. They're not very like static and like there's a, you know, there's some drama to it that I appreciate that isn't real, that a lot of like debaters don't do anymore. But I think that there still is a way of incorporating more helpful terms and preemptive offense that can be utilized because it seems insulated from a lot of the rest of the debate by the end. And this is even more present in the 2AR, where I think that there's almost some reinvention of like new terms that are used in ways that I think, you know, and where instead I think you should be just trying to remix them by then as like existing ones that you have to make it seem like it's less new. Yeah. On a flow level, sorry, I have like a lot of claims for the 2AC and I'm trying to make sure there's equitable for everyone. But on a flow level, I think you need more labels for arguments like you have with the labor disad. It makes it easier for you to divide up offense. I don't know if you need Gillens and Page. I guess they spend like a lot of time on it, but like I think you need a broader just like spill up argument for your advocacy. And I think that you're just like explanation on the case, it's good in terms of history. Like I like what you're doing and how you're flowing it together, but I just want a more contemporary spin. Like I'm just like, maybe that's just like my own personal biases, but I just think that there's so many examples about like how these things articulate themselves. I'd like more embedded clash versus these like these university protest arguments, instead of just like kind of a fear and running away from them. I'm like very interested in like, like what protests, like which ones are bound by like how does sociality implicate them in terms of, I don't know, I have a lot of questions about that. We can get back to that at some point later. I don't want to center there, but like, STEM things like that. Some more embedded clash with like the fact that the climate change impact is the terminal impact to kind of both teams. Like you have like this ecocide destruction of the earth through the logistical stomping out in the making of the world kind of thing. They have this argument that's just like, literally like accumulation is destroying the biosphere. I think that like positioning your offense and like your advocacy claims in relation to that, be it either just claims about like, these survival strategies argument as a living through or an adaptation to, or an argument about like why existing methods of parliamentary engagement do not have a chance of dealing with these things. I think that'd be better. I'd like to see a better articulation of the microfascism dissad that is, one, more charitable to the negs interpretation and like the politics they aspire to, and two, takes into account like the infiltration stuff more. I don't really love the like Clarence Thomas or Ben Carson arguments, partially because it's like a little weird that you only focus on like Black conservatives that infiltrate, but also just because that's not infiltration. Like that describes a broader question about like, do people buy into things that they like? Are those two indoctrinated into their own conservative values? Are they just trying to like get theirs? I don't know. Better examples might be people like Bobby Rush, who's like a Black Panther, who's now just like a moderate member of Congress, right, in like Illinois, or like Chokwe Lumbumba in Mississippi, whose like dad was like a radical, like, like Black Maoist, and now he's just like kind of a, he's a socialist mayor, but he's like had to make a lot of compromises in terms of things like policing and stuff. And I think that speaks to more like how both the institution compels one to kind of moderate their politics, and also how institutions themselves compel particular trade-off claims. Okay, static interpretation and reparation stuff should be articulated as a broader critique of predictability that's placed in like one location on the flow, not just line by line versus possible framework impacts, which is something throughout. And B should utilize the fact that they're like reading evidence from the OECD to inform their USFG definition, which like the Organization for Economic like Development, like, has a unique relationship with like improvement as predictable regulation. Wilderson and Moten, I think it's probably misplaced. I get what you are doing with it. I think that like the question of unasking is interesting. A better form of it exists in Blackness and Nothingness in a more generic sense. But truly what you need more here is like a defense of what is like kind of the structureless approach that the 1AC has to gathering more of these questions about how like sociality is a prerequisite to social movements. I'm thinking probably of like the Chambers Letson After the Party book, which cites Moten and Harney. It would also be worth having specific disads to Adolf Reed's model of the party, because it's like uniquely kind of what, I mean, like, he was someone that was like taken off the roster of like, they're reading like Hyanga Yamada Taylor cards. Like she replaced him in like NYC DSA's seminal speech on COVID a year ago, because of just like how class reductionist a lot of his politics are, and the fact that his political methodology and strategy is so very much focused on the consensus building and kind of using poll tested ideas in order to create a socialist base, which is kind of bad. Okay, last thing for the 2AC, it's missing some meta claims about the purpose of the debate to the 1AC and what the bounds of your spill out claims are. This shows up later when they make claims that debate can't shape subjectivity or that it shouldn't. The part of it that's missing the most is like the synaptic labor arguments that are articulated by Moten and how those connect to the ballot as a mode of habituating one into a rhythm or an algorithm. I think that is where a lot of, that shouldn't only be that should be your framework argument ultimately in terms of like how the AF relates to debate. But I still think that you need a broader bolstering of the advocacy level stuff about like how to conceptualize a movement. Okay, I'm gonna get to the neg more because I feel like that was a little bit of time. So Faith, cross-ex things. I think you're right to push in the 2AC cross-ex on the poem. And I think it's great the way that you kind of connect it to the fact that the app does have an extinction impact that they need to solve for. I think that like sitting here and conceptualizing more questions that like things along the lines of either like, here's a particular like revolutionary demand articulated against like on the state by particular radical movements. Is this something that the 1AC would like say is state reformist? And if they say like yes, that potentially gives you impact turn ground and doesn't let them access their permutation arguments or like their we don't trade off claims. And if no, then it gives you a grounds for like a potential TVA. You should also just ask about this Clarence Thomas example. I think that you could probably get mileage just by articulating that it's kind of weird and that like it's real and that like you're just like even just to like, am I suddenly Clarence Thomas now that I've said that any level of state engagement is potentially necessary? I think that there are other models of like potentially like good Black leaders that do engage in state-based politics that are probably better than ones people currently use. I mean, very contemporary based on the last few days, but like Cori Bush used a combination of electoralism and direct action in order to win an eviction moratorium that otherwise would not have happened. And like, what's up?
Can you say what you just said again?
Sorry,
my Zoom cut out.
Oh, your Zoom cut out? When did it cut out?
It cut out after the you should ask if you're Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, okay. What I was saying was there's other examples of movement organizers that engage in politics or even are elected leaders that I think are good counterexamples. So I was just talking about Cori Bush and the recent eviction moratorium fight that happened in the last week. But even to a greater extent, on a more local level, there's people like Jabari Brisport, who's a state senator from New York, who's like the first Black queer state senator, who hasn't like moderated himself like one singular bit and is generally great and like it's just like Stonewall's a riot, be queer, do crime, he tweeted out on the anniversary of Stonewall. Carol Fife as another one is an Oakland organizer who is formerly a part of Moms for Housing, which was doing direct action, like quote unquote squatting, as you could call it, in particular like houses that were being foreclosed upon, so that women, single moms were able, like single Black mothers were able to kind of get access to housing, and she used that as a launching point to then become an Oakland city councilor. I think examples like that are a lot more difficult to deal with on the reform question. So let's see, that was that. Let me make sure. Let me get to the 2NC. So Skycat. I think the block split created way too much of a burden for Faith, especially at the point where you're reading kind of 3 different cards to answer like Gillens and Page. And one of them is kind of just making see the political arguments that you've already read several cards on in the first place. I think you should kick case. And that if you move the infiltration stuff to case and like kind of make it streamline your arguments about proceduralism, you will have more time to do that. You do a really, like, I think the block is good. I think part of the reason that I have less immediate comments is that you're doing a lot of things well in terms of setting up the debate and introducing a lot of like, bomb throws that like potentially can be dangerous later on, like a lot of these ballot pick arguments, a lot of these proceduralism comes first, don't weigh the aft claims, like all of this is really good. You're setting up yourself up relatively strategically. My comment about what is your framework's interpretation of debate is relevant though, because I think there's different points in the flow where it can be suggested to be different things. Like towards the top, like there's even this weird distinction I think you create between like, we're not about advocacy skills, we're about testing. But I like, then earlier on in the debate, there's like a testing necessary to the types of under common relationality or spill out kind of stuff. And like debate, like, and I think you do your best on like the, debate doesn't shape subjectivity and or should not kind of debate. So I think just like clarifying a lot of those things and making sure that you're speaking from like one perspective on the potential of debate when you're on that flow will make it quicker to get through and make it easier for you to neutralize offense. When you're going for those testability arguments, I think you should try turning the Moten sections about endless revision that are on the AF solvency card, even if they're probably not like something that you solve and maybe something they could turn back on you. It at least will, I don't think that there's a ton of engagement with the question of what actually turning the case looks like in this debate. And I think that would be helpful. On the other end of things, I think that you're not doing nearly enough in terms of demonstrating contradictions in the affirmative in terms of improvement, competition, the way they buy into other ways of gamifying debate, the ways that they are like, even if they read a poem in one instance, they like, you do a little bit of this when you're like, they still abide by speech times and stuff. But I think that there's a much broader set of questions that needs to be asked here in terms of ways that the affirmative potentially generates contradictions and how those can provide defense to a lot of the impact turns they're trying to read to you.
So would one contradiction be that the affirmative provides a counterinterpretation, but then says the counterinterpretation is not static?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's potentially one, right? Like even just like it's a little bit more basic, but like something like, like exclusion inevitable, they have their own conception of predictability. So if it's about predictability being wholesale bad, then like they buy into that too. Just more of that, like it messes up the flow for them and makes the 1AR's job hell, which is better for you because then you can kind of clean things up by the 2NR a little bit more by being like, here's like 4 kind of impact takeouts just based on like contradictions or uniqueness claims. Similarly, I think like you do well with some of the fundamentals of just like making sure all the parts are there, but I think specific definitional violations and specific limits explosion arguments will make your offense sound more concrete, because I don't know, like it's like I can believe like maybe like it's right now the like internal link to limits explosion is like they say poetic AFs, but like anything can be poetry and any AF can say like RK of the resolution as the only AF that equals any infinite anything. I'm just like maybe a few examples or directly kind of draw lines between their interpretation and its potential implications, because that jump makes it, for me as a judge, makes it easier for me to discount your offense about fairness as being less important, because it's less concrete. And then I think while I think that you do good in terms of neutralizing specific offense at certain points, that some of your answers to some of their better claims could use more work. So for instance, your answer to the empiricism disad just kind of bites the link, but doesn't really deal with some of the specific warrants about why, like you kind of are just like, this doesn't link to us. We're about like refinement. Our version of Clash is key to refinement and testing. But that's like kind of exactly what this card is critiquing. You say some other stuff too, right? But I just mean like reclarifying some of your language to kind of push back against the spin that they're going to go for. Similarly, the answer to microfascism leans a little bit too into like personal expressions of identity are bad, I think. And like you go for this a bit, but it's not enough why like their particular, I think a better approach would be like their particular flattening of what left resistance can look like within the state is violent and or essentialist. in my version of the 2NC, this would be done on the case debate, but it would still cite a lot of the Clarence Thomas stuff, like business I was talking about above. But I think you just need a way of dealing with those kinds of microfascism arguments that just pose broader questions about, like, what about demands on the state? What about the fact that, like, role playing isn't what we really do here? What about, like, those kinds of pushbacks? Did you just have a question? I wanted to get to it if you did.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay, cool. And then I think a pivot more on the TVA debate to, like, how topical debates solve their offense, even if the TVA doesn't, would help. I'm a little bit of two minds of this, because on the one hand, I think the app could be a lot better about explaining why antitrust itself is the problem, or like emblematic of the problem. So obviously, I don't think that you have a lot of things to kind of directly embed your clash against in this particular debate, but you should assume the best version of their argument, which is that, like, the Amazon TVA has flaws and that, like, here's what they are, and then articulate how that progressive antitrust / antitrust social, like, moves towards socialism distinguish themselves from modes that might reject that as a strategic framework, and why those debates solve the type of education that they want. Okay. So Kate, I think your cross-ex push was not bad in spirit, but I think that it was just a little bit, you were asking too many open questions, and it just wasn't in the end offensive enough for being the last cross-ex in the debate. So for example, I think that, like, the part of it that got closest to being useful for you all was when you were pushing on the question of whether they can be open to being wrong. Like, that's an example. And I think in that context, you need to push them to, like, connect it to a specific tautology that they defend. So, like, on the one hand, right, I think that you're not paying enough attention to, like, their Gooden and Niemeyer evidence. That should be, like, read through your Moten evidence about reparation, or, like, several of your disads. And, like, you know, why it has these claims in it, right? I don't have it pulled up right now, but there's, like, these lines about, like, what it means to, like, fully understand or completely test an argument, right? That needs to be, like, kind of read through this question of truth testing. You need to ask the question about, like, how have you tested that your interpretation of the resolution is the most predictable way to approach the topic, right? How do you know that, like, your interpretation is true? Which gets into a question of whether predictability is defined socially or top down. And the answer to either of those questions will determine how you then engage with the predictability question through the Moten reparation disad later on. The 1NR, the overview is all right, but I think it's kind of just, like, a little bit of extending tags of 1NC cards and then reading a new card. And it makes a little bit of a missed opportunity, especially when you're already time constrained because you've been given this and the case. In a world where that happens, you need to just cut through to the key questions immediately, which is about whether performative and cultural resistance has relevance immediately for the building of political power. And whether, which is not to say that your alternative excludes those things, like you're sort of saying on T, right? But it's more so about, like, do particular instantiations of performance and methodology focus and subjectivity focus distract us or create a safety valve for the affirmative to not have to answer certain organizational questions, right? Which I think has immediate relevance for the labor disad, which I think you should be impact turning. I think that you need to be arguing that their understanding of interpersonal labor recreates a particular kind of individualism. It's almost like, how the initial way that, like, emotional labor was conceptualized in, like, social movement or social media spaces as, like, you know, I don't have a responsibility to answer that question for you. Do your own research. Like initially that was like kind of like a good faith thing by like a lot of really tired organizers who are predominantly like Black women, to be like, come on, like we've been saying this shit forever, right? But it's kind of led to like almost this like me search phenomena of just like a bunch of relatively upwardly mobile white people being like, I don't need to fucking educate you, go do your own shit. Like, and like, you know, which I think it's about like the distinction, right, between what they're calling like responsibility, which you should say is good. Like responsibility is something that like socialists ought to cultivate, and that people that are talking in the context of their affirmative believe in a collective sense, versus responsibilization, which is like how burdens of having to solve all of capitalism gets placed unfairly on certain shoulders. Those things are not the same. And in fact, the idea that we all should be responsible to one another turns a lot of the case impacts, precisely because how everyone can say it's just not their problem that the earth is being destroyed in the name of like the world, or like the fact that the neoliberalism of not being responsible for something disavows the collective responsibility of a given class in order to base build in a certain way, or the unique intersections that matter when your opponents are both like, they make this argument that 2AC, it's like, no, it's not just capitalism, it's also like settler and racial cap. And it's like, you're being talked to about this by two white, like presumably settlers, that have a unique responsibility in this context because of the way that their own like ancestors and or just privileged position in relation to the structure generates a certain responsibility for cleaning up the mess that like people that look like, you know, them and me have started, right? And sorry not to make too many assumptions here, but you know, and that also means, so the point about like kind of cutting through to like this organizing thing, like it's a question about the AF versus the alt way more than it is about like, does capitalism actually need to go? The impact to the AF is basically capitalism, except it's like, you know, maybe some other stuff too, but both teams agree capitalism probably causes like extinction. It's a question of what kind of spills up, given that, and you know, what is the most important starting point, which means that cards like Grubrichik on the perm are probably less helpful, considering that, and that it's more, and that I think a lot of the time frame questions that you posed in CrossX need to filter more into your speech. I want to hear about the alternative in general more, a clarified understanding of what the alternative's conception of base building and the conception of organizing a revolutionary class looks like, and what its pressure points are, right? Does that mean that it's like, it is like in Reed's sense, it's probably something like a combination of electoralism and unionization, right? But like in another sense, it could be something like communization and the development of maybe sub-state entities that are able to articulate demands in relation to a class, or organize sectoral strikes, and or being able to engage in particular forms of direct action or political education. You know, other things might be broad scale tenant organizing in order to revolutionize a broad class, right? These kinds of things need to be directly kind of dug into in order to make the alternatives claim about being material more than just like being the person that's in debate and saying we need to abolish cap, right? Because like at the point where it's just that kind of rhetorical move, it becomes a lot more difficult to distinguish the AF and the alt. There are a couple contradictions, not that you like made, but like maybe between the card choices. So like Reed is very much like a left liberal, like I was talking about earlier, right? Like his conception of socialism is like, we need to read, like he had a debate with Keeanga Yamada Taylor where he was like, reparations aren't important because we'll never be able to get the like 50% +1 mobilization of a class that will like ultimately be able to agitate for them, which is like silly, I think, at least, or like, you know, regardless, it doesn't matter if you're reading this, right? It just means that like the alternative card you read later on is a little like, that's about like revolutionary communism, is maybe not the same thing, or needs to at least be integrated a little bit better with the time that you'll have from not doing the case in the 1NR. Now, that all said, right, I think that the case debating, I think, is a lot better for you than some of the K. Like, Faith, you do a pretty good job on this burnout argument, and I wish that there was like almost more time dedicated to it. I think that you could have not really dealt with as many of the other presumption pushes and just sat on that one a little bit more. But I liked the way that you used it as an deterrent to their individuation offense. And I think that that should have been gone for in the 2NR, honestly. Okay, 1AR. So before I get into it, there's a couple things that weren't present that I noticed after the block as things I would have focused on. So I think you should really be questioning the assumption on the T-flow that debaters having their parts of their identity negated is an A, inevitable and already happening, which is the claim that you're making about microfascism, which is that certain people being forced to advocate for the USFG is also a form of, is also like a form of negation of certain people's identities. And just assuming that the neutral position of the resolution is something that like, it is just like assuming the non-marginalized person as the center or the kind of idealized subject, the ego ideal in the 2AR's parlance that gets to engage, and that, those people have no problem with engagement. They just view it as like a gamic exercise. So therefore, like, obviously everyone should view it that way, right? And then B, that like that identity something isn't something that should be encouraged. Like the negation of particular identities is, and like the capacity to deconstruct the selves that we walk into debate with is an advantage to the AF. So to the point where they're making arguments about like, oh, you lead to extremist positions, or I feel like you should be impact turning it. It's a way of proving that their conception of debate as a game solely is ultimately one that is a constructed conception, and it's a carefully policed conception, because anything that sounds mildly uncomfortable as something that might be more transformative in this activity, like negating like certain things about oneself, is kind of ultimately rejected out of hand. Same thing with like this extremist positions thing. Why is dogma bad in its own sense, right? Like, can't we be dogmatic about certain things? Like, why is dogma about the claim that the state is a colonial system necessarily bad? And their answer to that will be content level, i.e. like, well, there are certain instances where engaging the state can be good. And that resituates that section of the debate on your terrain for the 1AR and makes it easier for you to then win an impact turn on one flow and then filter it. Same thing with the claim that debaters will be like bad inevitably, which is a claim that the 2NC makes. If that's true, then like disrupting the ability of those people to gain skills is good. But also, it's probably not inevitable insofar as debate can be a site for social contestation where accountability for things like calling the cops at tournaments can be negotiated, and that proves that it's more than a game. So 1AR was definitely good. It needs to strategically utilize different neg missteps a little bit more in order to save yourself time. I think that in this place, this means literally flipping the order of the CAP-KN framework. If it weren't me, I would strategically be utilizing drops on CAP, like the arguments about root cause and the way that capitalism is also premised on chattel slavery and settler colonialism, to draw out different conclusions on framework, like whether state engagement is possible in a world where the state is not only capitalist, but also a colonial edifice premised on settler authority over native land and built by slaves. Some explanations, like I said earlier, are a little bit shaky. At different points, you say that you reject state engagement, and other times you say like perm do each. So you need to kind of think like, does perm do each mean rerouting movements? If so, like what's the specific way that you articulate a net benefit there? And there's just like a handful of missed arguments and distinctions from the 2NC. The ballot pick, I think, is the biggest one, which requires you kind of digging deep into the kind of synaptic labor stuff I mentioned before. Debate key to subjectivity, that's actually the same stuff, but it deals with it in both places. And you need a better K of this like Amazon example. It's like, I think it's basic. You need to articulate that like competition, like effective competition as the legal framework is what gets put in place in order to, bust Amazon. And there's this point in the 2NC where Skycat says that like, it'd be better if Amazon, like like instead of if there were like, you know, we should not have like one logistical overlord. And you should be using Moten's argument that he makes about the derivative in parts of the cards in order to say that, like, you know, it is not better to have a series, like a bunch of small logistical like overlords versus just one logistical overlord, because all of them are just like the idea of just like one big individual as subject versus like a lot of little individuals as self-possessing subjects, which like all of that's bad. We should refuse all of it. That's precluded in their interpretation, and starting with that as a point of pedagogy means their entire framework is bad. Okay, 2NR. Sorry, I know there's a lot of stuff here. Mostly really good. I think there's some good, but I think there's some big picture stuff as well as some efficiency stuff to improve. Where you excelled, we're extending particular dropped arguments and then implicating them in terms of embedded clash with app offense. Where you fell short was packaging those arguments into an easily digestible ballot and kind of kind of packaging them into unique sections of the debate that can be delineated as like kind of unique drops, which causes you to repeat yourself several times. The clearest example of this is just like advocacy skills, as the internal link to Turn's case is explained everywhere, like all over the flow. Oh, sorry, okay, there's Faith. Awesome, that's it. But you don't really warrant it in a particularly exceptional way, that advocacy skills argument, like anywhere in particular, which will be solved if you move it to just one location. Biggest thing is that even though you go for debate only has an internal link to testability and research through procedural norms, no worries, Faith. You still go for the political like arguments like infiltration, which somewhat confuses what the actual role of debate is and makes the neg ballot more complicated to adjudicate. Missed opportunities from the 1NR, I think, also exists. The first is that the case turn that I mentioned, I think that you should go for the burnout argument. The only argument you would need to answer the 1AR's response to it is the claim that political clarity is necessary to base building, which several cards on the K, especially Dudzik and Reed, already give you. And then you should have gone, I think, for the Reed 2000 card as a broad scale takeout to the AF, like about, you know, reasons why, you know, you need to impact, like, you know, if that card makes this claim about fanciful taxonomy, which is it's basically the claim that mundanity can be inherently resistive, which is claiming that like an individual like walkout or strike, it endows with those like particular examples that, which I think would be a uniquely good way of impact turning, like the way the 1A, the 2AC and the 1AR and the 2AR use their examples debates. And it says that like elevating those to like system-wide transformations ignores the type of material organizing necessary in order to universalize those to a broader class-wide struggle. And that would give you a broader kind of solvency takeout to the affirmative. Last but not least, okay, 2AR. Like I said, some of the language, Kate, is a little bit new. You need to remix terms that have already been introduced slightly more to prevent you from losing focus in sections of the debate. I think that the disembodiment stuff as a framework is good and needs to be framed as an impact turn to their identity-focused bad arguments. Like I was mentioning earlier, the argument that they're making that, like, you know, your version of debate leads to like debaters being reduced to only particular identity categories or structures of oppression, like kind of assumes that the alternative allows us to check our like identities and the structures that, you know, kind of like penetrate us like at the door of debate, which is the problem with proceduralism in the first place. And it's proven by the claim that they make that like you all are the ones that cemented the policy K divide. I think that that demonstrates like a way that proceduralism can't deal with structure, that like and actually kind of presumes a sort of almost like colorblind or like neutral understanding of how contestation occurs, that ignores that's like, no, like very particular structures of like racial antagonism, of political addiction, you know, is what cemented that particular divide. We did not contribute to that. And the fact that you blame us for that and then say that we lead to quote unquote extremist positions kind of just gives the whole game away. Instrumentalization offense is good. It would be better with coupled with a broader critique of trust busting, which about how, you know, starting the debate with Amazon trust busting requires internalizing the logistical imperative to improve capitalism, to generate something called effective competition, to move to the neo-Brandeisian, you know, understanding as opposed to the consumer, the kind of consumer focused understanding of monopolization. And then lastly, your arguments about ground. You all both kind of focus on like, y'all have ground, it's camp, y'all have files. These arguments can be helpful, but not unless they are framed within a broader theory of how competition occurs in debate that needs to occur on the counter-interpretation debate. And this is why I think it maybe doesn't make sense to kick Moten, because that card has a defense of like unrepresentability or felt modes of engagement that might exist below the surface. So you need to talk more about like what is an undercommon conception of the topic, because I don't like the poetry stuff makes sense as the grounding point, but like it doesn't generate an immediate understanding for me about why poetry can't be combined without this instrumentality stuff. But then even then it's like, is it instrumentalization if the neg is winning some defense? I don't know. I think that instead, you know, you need to like be making a broader question about predictability, which comes with it like kind of a reasonability-esque argument, a threshold pushback on testability. Like all of their impacts kind of depend on the claim that testing is impossible, not just that it's hard as the basis for like disavowing all of the case debate. And you need a claim that holding you to what you justify, not what you do, like is a like, you know, potential abuse, not a voting issue, but also that focusing on potential abuse is like a fearful regulation of like undercommon relationality and logisticality. Sorry, that was a series of rants. I just have had a lot of thoughts kind of throughout this debate. I want to be able to answer questions and see where each of you all are. And obviously all of these will be in your development docs as well.
I think that was really, really helpful. I was like taking notes, Jeremy can attest, got a giant document. I did have one question. Earlier you were talking about like arguments in which like, I mean, it's kind of a broader category of argument that I know we're gonna hit in terms of people positioning us specifically as settlers. And I want to figure out how to answer that without getting into like narrative, like personal lived experience type stuff where it's like no, my ancestors were not settlers, they were actually constantly fleeing genocide, and like I didn't contribute to that. But I don't know that that's like, is that the most strategic way to like, because I feel like identity type disclosure is like a bad norm for debate, so I don't know how you think answering that would look.
So in indigenous theory, there's a lot of concepts like for example, like Bird pulls from Kamau Brathwaite to develop the concept of like the Arvant as like someone who is engaged in, you know, forced migration. But, you know, ultimately like settlement is a structure, not an identity. I mean, it filters down into the level of identity insofar as one can probably be conceptualized as a settler if just like they're in relation to displacement, although that probably gets complicated at the level where our particular capacities for things like possession, like in the context of Blackness or, you know, other contexts of displacement exist. So I don't want to get caught up too much into that. You're good, Skycat. But what I do want to talk about is like, you know, responsibility as a concept is probably something that you're not going to be able to get out of. I think it will be more of a question in those debates about like when people call you on some of your examples and force you to kind of explain the interlinkages between the AF and things like the Haitian Revolution, the AF and like, you know, what was the 2AR example? The BPP, you know, I think that there will be more of a pushback, right? Something that this AF, and this is demonstrated at least in relationship to CAP, maybe needs a broader focus on, is like, you know, general antagonism as an idea that is articulated like somewhat not fully but existently in the Moten and Wollerson card is about how to conceptualize another way of thinking about class, maybe. Because class assumes a very unique position in Marxism that I think it's different than a lot of other kind of post-Marxist discourses that I think we've become familiar with in debate, and that it's not just a structure of oppression, but it's also a tool that allows for a particular set of organizing and the ability to cut through otherwise existing political disagreements or ideological conflicts by identifying series of common ground. In old school parlance, this is the term coalition. Nowadays, we're maybe a little bit more skeptical of those things, but like, you know, there is this other card in the AF file, but that where it's the like, we want a precedent card that is from Moten and Harney talking about this old speech called I Want a President, or that was, it was initially like a, how much of this I have to get into it. The first part of the card is not actually that important. The second part though is where it has this quote from Cedric Robinson, where he's just like asked this question of like, what if the idea of incompleteness took the place that inequality currently has within political philosophy, and then was an organizing principle that allowed for a broader conceptualization of like what a resistant base is, and then generated different conclusions about organizing from there. So that is an answer both to the kind of settlership question, because, you know, the question of like the general antagonism being subjectivity itself and the ego ideal as an imposition through logistics on everything, and a way of settling everything, means that there are certain like prerequisite claims you can make, or at least root cause arguments. And then separately, against a large variety of different kind of critiques, CAP included, Wilderson included, there is an argument that you can then make about the capacity to organize like a non-coalitional, but at least like mutually complicit conception of the undercommons as a horizontal, although, yeah, whatever, like conception of resistance. Now, all of that a little bit begs the question of what your relationship to debate is and whether debate and movement organizing have a relationship. But I think that somewhat answers your question.
What was the card you were talking about of incompleteness as an organizing principle?
It should be one of the first ones that are under solvency, like in the 2AC for the file.
Oh, I found it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Moten Harney 16.
Yeah, it's the bottom section. It's like section 3 or 4 in it.
Yeah.
And it's the little pull quote.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful.
Totally. Other inquiries?
I have questions about the 2NR. So you thought I should go for the burnout argument in the 2NR. How do you think I should have articulated it?
I think that the 1AR response was basically just like, we don't need clarity in order to access politics, moving on. Kind of like, I think that you should cross apply at least the evidence from CAT. Like, it's maybe a little bit of a new argument because I don't know if Faith like extrapolated this particular warrant in the 1NR, but like, you know, Dudzik and Reed clearly make arguments that like a clearly defined platform is a necessary component of socialist organizing. So like, I think that you could clearly make the claim that like, because the internal link to burnout is like organizers have a lack of clarity about particular solutions, and as a result engage, like are forced to kind of constantly try different things, and or like, you know, they don't really know like what they should be doing, which leads to kind of just like a lot of movements spinning their wheels, or like movements turning like just like, you know, online bullshit. Like, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways you could articulate the internal link, but the clear part that you just need is like clarity good for organizing good to organizing in a clear fashion good to prevent organizers from burning out, because just like, you know, unbridled direct action without a capacity for planning is probably not the best thing in the world, which means even if you don't have like an alternative that solves that, it at least means that the affirmative can't solve their own impact through like the kind of individualism turn that was articulated in the 1NR. Because I don't think there was any defense in the 1AR to that case turn components of the argument. So
this is kind of like a broad question, but I kind of tuned you out when you were giving feedback on the 1AR because my head hurt a lot. But
totally.
So what did you think I could have done better in the 2NR?
The biggest thing would be collapsing your version of debate to proceduralism, be like, just like, and then kind of using the different dropped arguments that you're making in more of a sequenced even if place. So like the way I mean by this, right? You're currently just kind of extending these arguments one after each other, which creates like kind of an implicit set of thoughts in my mind about how you understand debate. But like, if you were just like, they've conceded a couple arguments that mean that debate can never produce the type of spill out or education offense that their stuff depends on. Ace the point, they've conceded that like, we don't remember individual rounds. The content of individual debates forces us to always vote for or advocate for things we don't believe in, which means that there's not a direct one-to-one spill out. Any residual, even if they win, that there is some educational offense, they've conceded some pushback to their ability to access critiques of improvement because they still believe in certain structures of debate, and because they still are attached to the ballot. I'm going to extend the ballot pick now because that offers you a way out if you think that they're weighing some of their offense. You know, that kind of sequencing of things one after another, this means that you can evaluate this in this way, is the type of judge instruction that pushes you a couple speaker points up and that allows you to win those break rounds where it's like the judge is like, okay, there's offense on both sides, but like, I don't really understand how I'm supposed to interpret all of it together. Yeah. It's like you're going for mostly the right arguments. I just need you to kick some stuff that's like somewhat wedded to vision of debate as potential, like, or to the extent that you go for education-based offense that's like infiltration good, frame it as an even if, right? Be like, even if they win, that there is some advocacy skill potential in debate that is something that can only be mediated through politics, blah, blah, blah.
So should I have done the infiltration stuff like on case?
I think so, just because like the way I always saw it, right? You want your flows to do different things for you such that the 1AR and the 2AC and whatever can't just like go for one central frame and then impact turn everything. Because the problem with this 1NC is that all three flows lose to state bad, right? Like, and you need to make it more that like the 2NR or the 2NR can go for a version of framework that is just like agnostic about whether the state is good or bad, says that like it ultimately doesn't matter because that doesn't implicate how we ultimately debate. So if you can insulate that flow by just making it only about procedure, then you only have to defend state good on 2 flows as opposed to 3. And you can still go for that version of framework if you want to later on in the debate, but it makes it so you don't have to get wed to that.
So what do you mean by procedural impacts? Do you mean the clash or like fairness impacts?
I conceive those as like largely the same. I mean, fairness is like the more like it's good in of itself version, kind of like competitive equity, key to education kind of stuff. But like even then, like clash is basically just like the internal link between fairness and education. Like they're kind of synonyms. There might be possible distinctions based on individual ways of describing it, but like the key part, right, is that like what distinguishes one version from the other is whether debate has the capacity to generate external impacts, right? If you say that it doesn't, then you need to only go for impacts at the level of the game and at the level of contestability. Does that make sense as like a distinction? Yeah. It can be a little murky because like advocacy skills impacts are a little bit in like the portable skills section, which is like in between both of those a little bit, and can be either, but that's kind of just like why you have to use clear delineation throughout in order to make it so that you're not going to get held accountable for offense that you might otherwise want to kick out of. Anyone else have any questions? Or Skycat, did you have one more?
Can I book office hours with you?
Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
No problem.
No, go ahead.
Can I book office hours with you later
Yes.
on?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Anyone here can, if you would like to. Folks, mostly good.
Thank you for judging this round.
Totally.
I think these speech comments may have been longer than the round itself, which I think is how helpful they've been.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. Can be a
No,
little
it's all good.
long-winded.
These were awesome. I have so many notes.
I was filling out the like exit interview form that Jasmine like wants us to do, and there's a part of it where it's like Greg Zoda, how is he as a consultant? I'm just writing here like, man's given so many helpful comments, like it's been an hour already. I don't know, like fingers are bleeding typing these. It's
Well, I appreciate it. I think about these types of debates a fair bit. So I try to help people filter through things.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Totally. I gotta go see what these puppies are barking at.
To go eat
Yeah,
some
no
food
worries.
for the rest of the day.
So
Bye.
long.
Peace.
Bye, Kate. Bye, Jeremy.